The drought had been killing the village for 3 months. The children were sent 8 versts away for water, where they were robbed and beaten. And on the day of his initiation, the goddess assigned him a class that had the whole temple in stitches. Plumber. Pipe laying. Level 1. No one noticed the one thing. This kid had just sensed 3 underground rivers beneath their feet. Now let's rewind. Daniel Hayward died on the bridge over the Willamette. A truck cut him off on the wet asphalt, a side impact collision. The car is thrown into the guardrail, metal screeches, concrete cracks, and the black water of the river flies toward the windshield. The last thing he remembers is the cold pouring in through the shattered window and pulling him down. He was drowning, and he woke up in a stranger's body on prickly hay, surrounded by the smell of goat manure. The hay pricks his cheek. Somewhere to his right, a goat is chewing. The hands are not his, short. He brings them to his face and doesn't recognize them. A teenager's fingers, thin, not a single callus from the theodolite he'd been rubbing against for 20 years. Above him, the crooked beams of a wooden ceiling, old, black with soot, clearly not his apartment in Portland. In the doorway stands a red-haired girl with a scattering of freckles on her nose, chattering away in a language he shouldn't know, but he understands every word. She calls him brother. She yells that he's overslept again, and the headman will tear his ears off if he doesn't run to the temple. Dan blinks. Then again. A goat is chewing on his sleeve. He's already died once. Panicking a second time would be wasteful. He stands up. His head is spinning. His body feels light and empty, as if 30 kilograms of experience had been ripped out of him, leaving only bones. The girl's name is Amber. She's the stepsister of the guy whose body he's fallen into. She grabs his arm and drags him to the door. He steps outside and sees the village. 3 dozen houses with thatched roofs, a dirt road, a well in the middle of the square, dry fields beyond the outskirts. Not a single car, not a single wire, not a sound of an engine. But on the hill stands a stone temple with columns, and a crowd in simple clothes is streaming toward it along the road. Today is the day of initiation. The guy has turned 16. The goddess architect is assigning classes. And this is where the main part begins. The class decides everything: a job, status, future wife, seat at the table. Amber chatters non-stop and prays that her brother will get a combat class, even an archer, even a tracker. Their father is a blacksmith. Their mother is an herbalist. Every evening, both of them ask the goddess for their son to be given something worthy. Dan nods and takes it all in, and then he freezes in the middle of the road. 8 meters below his feet, water is flowing. He feels it as distinctly as a toothache. A faint vibration pulses through the soles of his holy boots. Sandstone, good flow, clean water. Amber tugs at his arm. He doesn't move. He listens to the river beneath the ground. And for the first time in 10 minutes, he feels not fear, but professional interest. The temple is larger inside than out. Stone walls, torches smolder. A huge slab in the center of the hall glows blue beneath a layer of ancient symbols. A priest in white robes calls the teenagers up one by one. A boy steps onto the stone. The symbols flare up. An inscription appears. The priest reads it aloud. The crowd roars. The first one gets a warrior. His father slaps him on the back so hard he nearly falls off the slab. The second gets an archer. That's good too. The third, a girl, gets a healer, and her mother weeps with joy right in the front row. Dan watches and recognizes the mechanics. A class system. Magic as the foundation of the world. Destiny at 16. Everything is just like in those fantasy novels his dorm mate used to devour. Only here, it's all real. Sweat on their faces, the smell of dust and torches, the tremor in the hands of the girl waiting her turn, twisting the hem of her skirt. The priest calls his name, or rather, that guy's name. Dan steps onto the slab. The stone is warm under his bare foot. The symbols flare up brighter than anyone else's. They fade. They flare up again. The priest frowns. The letters appear slowly, as if the stone itself doesn't believe what it's writing. The priest reads them again, and looks at Dan as if he were a man being told he's dead. Class, plumber. Starting skill, pipe laying. Level 1. Silence hangs in the temple. Then someone snorts into their fist. Then the whole village roars with laughter. The village elder crosses himself. Amber hides her face in her hands. The blacksmith father stares at the floor in the back row. The mother walks right out without looking back. And Dan closes his eyes and sees, not with his eyes, with something else. The water beneath the church. 3 layers. The top layer is murky and shallow. The middle layer is more serious. The bottom layer is deep and clear. He sees the direction of the current, the volume, the temperature. The aquifer unfolds before him like a blueprint before an engineer, as if someone had taken everything he knew about hydraulic engineering over 20 years and turned it into a 6th sense. He opens his eyes. People are still laughing. Dan looks at his hands, those of a teenager in a foreign world with the most useless class in 200 years. And he smiles, because they're laughing at a plumber in the middle of a drought. They just haven't figured it out yet. Amber catches him at the exit. Her eyes are red, her voice is trembling. She whispers that she's sorry, and that maybe the goddess made a mistake, and that her father will surely come up with something. Dan puts his hand on her shoulder. He says everything's fine, that he needs a shovel, 2 people who know how to dig, and fired clay from a potter's kiln. Amber looks at him like he's crazy. He says that in 3 days the village will have water, clean, cold, 200 liters an hour, and he leaves without waiting for an answer. Amber will later say that in that moment, for the first time, she noticed a change in her brother. Not his voice, not his face, his gait. He walked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He had never walked like that before. The village of Littlebrook had been dying of thirst for 3 months. The only well in the square yielded 2 buckets of murky sludge a day. The village elder had already drawn up a list of children to be sent with buckets to the stream 8 versts away. The road was dangerous. Wolves. Bandits who were thirsty too. Last time, a boy named Tommy had been robbed right on the trail and returned with a bruise covering half his face and empty buckets. Dan went to see the village elder that evening. The village head is sitting on the porch, a heavy-set, bald man in his 50s with heavy hands. He stares at the dry field without interest. The village already knows about the class, a joke of the goddess. Dan says he'll find water. The village head asks if he's a vine walker. No, an engineer. The village elder doesn't know that word. Dan asks for 2 men with shovels and access to the potter's workshop. 3 days. The village elder asks, what if nothing works out? Dan replies that he'll lose 3 days and a little clay. But if it works, the village will stop sending children to their deaths. The village head chews on this in silence. Then he waves his hand. It can't get any worse. Dan starts that very night. He goes to the outskirts where the vibration hits hardest. He crouches down. He presses his palm against the dry, cracked earth. He freezes. Passers-by tap their fingers against their temples. Borin, the blacksmith, the one who laughed the loudest in the temple, stops and asks what he's doing. Dan doesn't answer. He listens. 16 meters down. Sandstone. The water is clear, low in minerals. 8 degrees. Perfect. He stands up and tells the blacksmith that there will be a well here. The blacksmith grunts and walks off into the darkness. In the morning, 2 men arrive, not volunteers. The village elder simply assigned those who had nothing more important to do. They look at Dan skeptically. He pays no attention, activates the skill. Pipe laying, level 1. And he feels the magic flowing through his hands into the ground. A strange sensation, as if the earth beneath his palms is becoming soft. Not all of it. A narrow column, half a meter wide, exactly where he pointed. The rock spreads apart, forming a smooth borehole. Slowly, a meter an hour, but steadily. No collapses, with walls as smooth as cast. The guys with shovels stand with their mouths agape. One whispers quietly that it's magic. Dan replies that it's drilling, but he doesn't argue. By evening, the shaft is 6 meters deep. Dan staggers and nearly falls into the pit. His head is spinning, his mouth is dry. Amber appears with a mug of water and a piece of bread. She scolds him for being an idiot for working all day without eating. Dan drinks. He looks at the empty mug and thinks that in 2 days there will be as many mugs as he wants. On the second day, onlookers gather, about 10 people. They sit on the fence and watch as the kid kneels by the hole and moves his hands. 10 meters. 12. The aquifer is close. Dan activates the second part of the skill, pipe formation. Using the clay the potter brought, the skill molds ceramic rings, rough and thick, but smooth and tightly fitted. They are lowered into the shaft one after another like a casing string. At the first level, only clay is available to him, but for a shallow well, clay is standard. In Portland, he worked with ceramics that lasted 100 years. The key is firing and diameter. By evening on the 3rd day, the shaft reaches the aquifer. Dan senses it before he sees it. The vibration under his hands comes alive. The water is right here. He molds a filter cap, a simple one, gravel packing and a perforated ceramic ring. That's how they built wells back in ancient Rome. Then he sets up a lever pump. Experience guides the design. A ceramic cylinder, a wooden rod, a leather valve. Dan assembles it from whatever's at hand. He squeezes the lever for the first time. Air comes out. The second time, murky water. The third time, clear, cold, transparent, with a slightly sweet aftertaste. He fills a mug and hands it to the village elder. The elder drinks, looks at the mug, at Dan, back at the mug, and says nothing. But you can tell by his face that he's counting how many children won't be walking down the path to the stream now. By nightfall on the 3rd day, the whole village had gathered at the well. 58-year-old Grandma Meg comes with an empty bucket. She fills it, she tastes it, and she cries. She says that for the first time in 6 months, she'll wash the dishes without using water from a puddle. Dan stands nearby and feels the manna returning to his body, heavily and slowly. 3 days of work have drained him dry. The skin on his hands is cracked. His lips are chapped. His eyes are sunken. Amber comes over and quietly says he looks terrible. Dan replies that the flow rate is 200 liters an hour and the village will have more than enough. Amber says she isn't talking about the well, but about him. And for a second, he sees in this red-haired girl the people for whom it's worth laying pipes. He says he'll rest tomorrow. He's lying. By morning on the 4th day, he's already sitting at the table, sketching a water supply diagram with charcoal on a scrap of wood. 30 houses, 1 source. He needs a distribution system. 3 water outlets so the old ladies don't have to lug buckets across the whole square. The elevation difference is minimal. That means he needs a storage tank on high ground. A water tower, the simplest kind. A barrel on posts. hand-pumped supply, gravity-fed distribution, ceramic pipes in trenches. He draws and feels his skill respond to every line, as if the system is telling him this is right, that this is exactly why he's here. Blacksmith Boren comes in to take a look. He stands behind him. He looks at the drawing in silence. Then he places his best hammer in front of Dan. He says the boy needs it more than the blacksmith does. And he leaves. Dan picks up the hammer. Heavy. Good steel. A comfortable handle. He places it next to the drawing and works on. He has his eye on 5 neighboring villages, and it's the same everywhere. Dry wells, children with buckets, old people drinking murky sludge from puddles. And beneath every village, he senses water. It's there. It's always been there. It's just that no one knew how to reach it. Until today. During the first week, Dan didn't take a single full day off. The 16-year-old's body was recovering faster than he expected. His mana returned overnight. Not all of it. About 70%. But that was enough to get back to work in the morning. He started by mapping out Little Brook. They dug the trenches by hand. The 2 guys the foreman had assigned on the first day now showed up on their own. 3 more joined them. One of them, a red-haired hulk named Grant, turned out to be surprisingly smart. He didn't ask questions. He just watched what Dan was doing and copied him. When Dan explained to him that the pipe had to be laid at a 2-degree slope so the water would flow by gravity, Grant nodded and never laid a pipe crooked again. Dan took note of him. People like that are worth their weight in gold on a construction site. He shaped the ceramic pipes with skill. Each one cost mana. Not much. A meter of pipe with a 10-centimeter diameter cost a fraction of energy. But there were a lot of meters. From the well to the storage tank. From the tank to 3 water outlets. A total of about 200 meters. Plus the connections. Plus a valve on the main line. A simple one. A ceramic plug with a lever. But it worked. 5 days later, the village had 3 faucets. Lever-operated. Primitive, but water flowed from them. The storage tank stood on a hill behind the village, a fired clay barrel on wooden supports, 4 meters high, a capacity of about 1,000 liters. Every morning, Grant pumped for 20 minutes to fill the tank. Then the water flowed by gravity all day. That was enough. The village headman came to see Dan on the 6th day. He brought a small bag of copper coins. He said that was all the village could pay. Dan looked at the bag, then at the headman, and said he didn't need money. He needed food for the crew and access to the pottery workshop. The village head nodded. From that day on, Dan and his men ate for free at the village head's house. Amber took over the cooking. She cooked for 6 people every day. She complained that Dan ate like a sparrow and worked like an ox. She brought him hot tea to the worksite when he stayed late. One evening, she sat down next to him on a log by the trench and was silent for a long time. Then she said he had changed. He asked in what way. She said he used to be loud, rude. He used to get into fights. He dreamed of becoming a warrior, but now he was quiet and confident, and he said things she hadn't heard him say before. Dan said nothing. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not now. Maybe not ever. Amber said she didn't care who he had become, that she liked this new brother better than the old one, and she left. Dan sat on the log and thought about the fact that he now had a sister, a real one, a living one, who brought him tea and scolded him for missing dinner. In his past life, he had an empty apartment and a cat that his neighbor fed. The system gave him a new level on the 7th day. Level 2. The skill had expanded. The radius of his hydrosensing had increased from 20 meters to 35. The ability to create more complex connections appeared. T's, elbows, adapters from one diameter to another. Trivial for any engineer, but here it was magic. Dan felt the knowledge from his past life integrating into this world system. Every technical technique he remembered became part of the skill, as if the architect goddess had copied his professional memory and translated it into the language of magic. It was beautiful. He spent the rest of the week exploring. He walked around the outskirts of Littlebrook. He listened to the earth. He mapped out the aquifers in his head. South of the village, at a depth of 20 meters, lay a powerful aquifer. It would be enough for a town of 1,000 people. To the east, the aquifer was shallower and dirtier. It would need filtering. To the north, it was completely dry. Granite. Water bypassed this area entirely. He memorized everything. He drew charcoal sketches on scraps of wood. Amber collected these scraps and stacked them. She didn't understand what was drawn on them, but she treated them seriously, as if they were important. At the start of the second week, a man from neighboring Hollow came to the village, a gaunt man with a weather-beaten face. He'd heard about the well in Littlebrook. He asked if it was true that a boy had found water underground here. The village elder pointed to Dan. The man approached. He looked him up and down. He asked how much he wanted for the well in Hollow. Dan said he needed to see the site. The man said their well had dried up 2 months ago, that 3 old men had died of dehydration, that the children were drinking dew in the mornings. Dan stood up and said he was going right now. Amber tried to object. She said he hadn't rested, that his mana hadn't fully recovered yet. Dan said that people were drinking dew and that rest could wait. Amber fell silent. Then she packed him a bag of food and a flask, and said she would go with him. Dan didn't argue. Hollow turned out to be a 3-hour walk away. A village smaller than Littlebrook, 24 houses, a dried-up well with a cracked log cabin. The ground was gray and lifeless. Dan crouched down. He placed his hand on the ground. He listened for 5 minutes. Then he stood up and said the water table was deep, 22 meters. But it was there. There was water. In 2 days, he drilled a well in Hollow. He worked harder than he had in Littlebrook because the depth was greater and the rock was denser. By the evening of the second day, his hands were shaking so much he couldn't hold a mug. Amber held the mug to his mouth and cursed under her breath. But the water was flowing, and when the old woman from Hollow filled the first bucket and the children ran up with their mugs, Dan realized one thing. He needed helpers. One man couldn't supply the whole region with water. The skill only worked through him, but others could do everything else. Dig, haul clay, mark out the route, maintain the pumps. He needed a crew. Returning to Littlebrook, he spoke with Grant. He asked if Grant wanted to work with him full-time. Grant thought for exactly 3 seconds and said yes. The next day, Potter Will joined them, a short, bald man who made the best fired clay in the county. He said he was tired of making pots that no one buys, because nobody cares about pots when they have nothing to wash down their bread with. Pipes, at least, make sense. The third to arrive was Nora, Grant's wife, a quiet woman with strong hands. She said she knew how to do the math. Dan asked what exactly. She said she'd kept the books at the tavern for 10 years and could calculate any expense. Dan didn't hesitate. He needed someone to keep track of resources: clay, wood, food for the crew, time. All of that needs to be accounted for. By the 3rd week, he had drilled wells in 2 more villages, Millwood and Stonehill. In Millwood, the aquifer turned out to be contaminated. High iron content. The water ran rust-colored. Dan installed the simplest filter: gravel backfill and a layer of river sand in a ceramic casing. Not ideal. But the water became clear and drinkable. In Stonehill, the problem was different. The aquifer was deep but powerful. However, a layer of dense clay lay between it and the surface. The drill struggled to break through it. Dan spent 3 days on this well instead of 2. His level rose to 4. The system began offering him new material options. Stone. Not just any stone. Granite. Polished by his skill until it was as smooth as glass. Pipes made of such granite would last for centuries. But stone requires level 6. For now, just clay. At the end of the first month, he sat in the village headman's house in Littlebrook and did the math. 5 villages, 5 wells, 3 water lines, a crew of 4, not counting him. Level 6. The radius of his hydrosensing was nearly 100 meters. Word of him was spreading. People from distant villages came to Littlebrook and asked about the guy who finds water. Some didn't believe it until they saw the well with their own eyes. Some believed right away because someone dying of thirst doesn't need proof. Amber ran the household. She fed the crew, she kept track of supplies. She argued with Dan that he spent everything on materials and nothing on himself. He still had holy boots. She bought him new ones with the money Stonehill had paid. Dan put them on and said his feet felt unusually dry. Amber looked at him as if he were hopeless, but she said nothing. One evening after work, Dan sat on the porch and looked at the stars. The sky here was bright, no city lights. The Milky Way was visible as if in a photograph. He thought about Portland, about his apartment, about the storm drain blueprints on the table that no one would ever finish now, about the cat. Then he thought that all of that was in another life, and in this life, 5 villages were drinking clean water because he had laid the pipes. And that thought warmed him more than any memory. Amber came out onto the porch with 2 mugs of tea. She sat down next to him. She didn't say a word. They sat in silence and drank tea. Somewhere in the house, Nora was scolding Grant for his dirty boots. A dog was barking behind the fence. In the square, water was trickling from a faucet. That sound, the trickling of water in the silence. Dan closed his eyes and listened to it, and he thought that for the sake of that one sound alone, it had been worth dying on the bridge over the Willamette and waking up in the hay. In the first month, Dan supplied water to 5 villages, including Littlebrook. He assembled a crew of 4. He rose to the 6th level. Amber became the logistical backbone of the entire operation. Rumors about him began to spread throughout the district and would soon reach the county town of Asheford. The invitation from Asheford arrived at the beginning of the 3rd month. A messenger riding a skinny horse, a scroll bearing the town council's seal, an official request to come and inspect the town's aqueducts. Dan unrolled the scroll and read it twice. Then he asked the messenger what condition the aqueducts were in. The messenger said they were in poor condition. 3 of the 5 lines were not working. The remaining 2 were supplying water intermittently. A city of 15,000 people was operating at a quarter of its normal capacity. The bathhouses were closed, the laundries were closed, the fountains had run dry. Dan said he would be there in 2 days. The messenger left. Amber asked why he needed to go to the city. There were 10 more villages here, waiting for wells. Dan replied that 300 people live in the village, while 15,000 live in Asheford. Amber fell silent. Then she began packing her things. Dan took Grant and Amber with him. He left the rest in Littlebrook. Nora and Will continue to maintain the existing wells. The trek to Asheford took a day and a half on foot. The roads were dusty and empty. The fields along the roadside were yellow and dead. Not a single patch of green. The drought had reached here before it reached the mountain villages. Dan walked and listened to the ground beneath his feet. The aquifers are deeper here, 25 meters, 30 meters, but they're there. They're everywhere. The problem isn't a lack of water. The problem is that no one knows how to get to it. Asheford opened up from the hill like a scattering of stones in the valley. Walls, towers, roofs, the market square, a church bigger than the one in Littlebrook, and aqueducts. Dan saw them from a distance. 4 stone arches stretched from the foothills to the city. Once, water from mountain springs had flowed through them. Now they stood dry, gray, like the bones of a dead animal. Dan stopped and stared at them for 10 seconds. Then he said quietly that the springs in the mountains had dried up and the aqueducts were useless. We need to change the concept. Grant asked what it meant to change the concept. Dan said it meant forgetting about the mountains and drilling right in the city. The Asheford City Council was meeting in City Hall, 7 people at a long table. Merchants, artisans, 1 former soldier, not a single mage. Mages in this city were a separate caste and did not sit on the council. Dan walked in and saw 7 pairs of tired eyes. They looked at him and saw a 16-year-old boy in dirty clothes, the head of the council, a fat man named Master Horton. He asked if it was true that he had found water for 5 villages. Dan confirmed it. Horton asked if he could repair the aqueducts. Dan said no. You can't fix something that draws from a dead source. A new system is needed. The council buzzed with discussion. One of the merchants said that the aqueducts had been built by gnomes 300 years ago and that they had cost a fortune. Dan replied that the cost of construction didn't matter if the water wasn't flowing. The merchant flushed. Another council member asked what Dan proposed. Dan asked for a map of the city. They gave him an old, worn map on parchment. He spread it out on the table. And then a woman emerged from the corner of the hall, tall, thin, dressed in men's clothing, round glasses on a chain, a silvery sheen on the skin of her hands and neck. She approached the table in silence. She took a rolled-up sheet of paper out of her bag, unrolled it, and placed it on top of the old map. It was a map of Asheford, but not like the one on parchment. This map showed elevations, changes in terrain, drainage lines, the outlines of basements and cisterns, groundwater depths. Dan stared at this map and couldn't breathe. It was the best map he'd ever seen in his life. More accurate than anything he'd come across in the Portland Municipal Archives. He looked up at the woman. She was looking at him from behind her round glasses, silently. He asked who she was. She said her name was Heirin Sun, that she was a cartographer, that she was a level 12 cartographer, and that she had drawn this map 3 years ago for the city council, but the council had put it in a drawer and forgotten about it. Dan said she had a wonderful tool in her head, and that he apologized for being so blunt. Hayden was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she wanted to work with him full time. Dan agreed without hesitation. He spent the next 3 days on his feet. He walked through Asheford block by block. He listened to the ground. Hayden walked beside him and marked every spot where he stopped on the map. He told her the depth, the rock type, the approximate flow rate. She took notes. By the evening of the 3rd day, they had a complete map of Ashford's underground water resources. Dan laid it out before the council and said there were 3 powerful aquifers beneath the city. The most productive was at a depth of 28 meters in the southeastern part of the city. From there, water could be supplied to all of Asheford. But this would require not just a well, but a full-scale system. Storage tanks, a main pipeline, a distribution network through the neighborhoods. The council asked how much it would cost. Dan looked at Hayden. Hayden looked at the map. Dan said the money part was minimal. His skill allows him to make pipes from local materials, stone, clay. The main costs are labor and time. He needs 30 people for 2 months, and access to all the city's basements and cisterns. The council deliberated for an hour. Then Horton came out and said they agreed, but on one condition. If there was no water in 2 months, they wouldn't pay a thing, and he would leave. Dan shook his hand. Work began the next day. Dan divided the city into 4 sectors: southeast, northwest, central, and the port district by the river. Or rather, by what used to be a river. The Sylvan River had shrunk to a muddy stream. For each sector, he designed a separate branch connected to the main line. Rin drew up the route profiles, Grant supervised the diggers, Amber organized the supplies, food, tools, materials. She found 3 local cooks and arranged with a baker for daily bread deliveries for the crew. Dan worked 12 hours a day. His skill allowed him to shape the pipes faster than before. Level 6 granted access to stone, granite pipes, smooth on the inside, durable, with perfect cross-sectional geometry. He laid 100 meters a day if the rock allowed it, but his mana ran out quickly. By evening, he could barely stand on his feet. Dehydration, a side effect of the skill. His body gave up moisture as payment for every meter of pipe. Amber brought him water every hour. He drank 10 liters a day. And still, by nightfall, the skin on his hands was dry as parchment. The first problem arose in the 3rd week of work. The port district, the poorest district in the city. Dan was laying the main line through the narrow streets and stumbled upon a basement that wasn't marked on any map. Rin checked her records. The basement wasn't supposed to be there. Dan went downstairs. A torch, a low ceiling, the smell of dampness, and people. 12 people, women and children. They lived here, in the dark, hiding. One of the women said they were refugees from Gracetown, that their city had closed its gates to outsiders when the water riots began, that they had come to Asheford but were denied residency permits, and they were hiding in the basement because if the guards found them, they'd be driven out beyond the walls. Dan stood in that basement and watched the children drinking water from a rusty bucket. He asked where the bucket came from. The woman said they steal water from the city cistern at night. Dan was silent for a minute. Then he went upstairs. He approached Rin and said that the route of the main pipeline through the port district needed to be changed. The pipe would go through this basement. Rin raised an eyebrow. Dan said there would be a water tap in the basement. Rin said the council wouldn't approve spending on illegal refugees. Dan replied that the council wouldn't see a separate line item for the expense. The pipe would simply take a slightly different route, technically optimal. The fact that it passes through a basement with people along the way is a coincidence. Rin took off her glasses and wiped them. Then she put them back on. Then she said that the elevation change on the new route was even better and that it really was the technically optimal option. Dan nodded. They both knew that wasn't true, but the map doesn't lie, and Rin draws the map. By the end of the 5th week, the main line was ready. 700 meters of stone pipe from the well in the southeastern part of the city to the central distribution hub. 4 branches radiated out from the hub, each with its own valve. Dan stood by the main valve and felt the entire system as an extension of his own body. Every joint, every turn, every meter of pipe. He turned the valve. The water flowed. Slowly, with a dull rumble against the stone, filling the main line meter by meter. He could feel its movement, like a pulse. On the surface, in different parts of the city, people stood at water outlets and waited. The first water reached the central district, murky, then clear, cold. Someone cupped their hands and drank straight from the pipe. Dan didn't see this. He stood by the valve with his eyes closed and listened as the water filled the city. Dan arrived in Asheford and began building the city's water supply system to replace the dead aqueducts. He met cartographer Herin Son, who became his key partner in the design. He secretly ran water to the refugees in the basement of the port district. The main line is built and operational. Ahead lies the completion of the distribution network and the inevitable attention from those for whom the water monopoly brings in money. Water had been flowing in Ashford for 2 weeks when Kasia showed up. Dan had been working late. The crew had gone their separate ways. Herin had gone to draw up an updated map of the network. Grant was sleeping in the workers' barracks. Amber had gone to Littlebrook to check on Nora and Will. Dan sat alone in a tent on the outskirts of town. A drawing lay before him. A drainage plan for the leper colony beyond the southern wall. No one considered them human. The city council hadn't even included them on the connection lists. But Dan could see on Ha Rin's map that it was only 120 meters from the southern branch of the main line to the colony. 120 meters of pipe, half a day's work, and 27 people would stop drinking from the ditch. He was drawing and didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't see the shadow. He felt nothing until the blade of a dagger rested against his neck. Cold, thin, a professional touch. Dan froze. A voice behind him, a woman's, low, mocking. She asked if he was the pipe fitter. Dan said yes. She paused. Then she said that Baron Halvik had paid her 50 gold pieces to have him out of the way. Dan thought for a second. Then he said that was a pitifully small sum. For a man who had provided water to 15,000 townspeople, one could have asked for at least 100. The dagger shifted slightly. Silence. Then a soft chuckle. She asked what he was drawing. Dan said it was a drainage system for lepers. The dagger didn't move. She stood behind him for 10 minutes. Dan kept drawing. His hands didn't tremble. Not because he was brave, but because the drawing had to be finished by morning, and if he were killed now, the lepers wouldn't get water, and he'd already calculated the slope and diameter, and it would be a shame if the calculations were lost. 10 minutes later, the dagger vanished. Dan turned around. A tall woman, dark skin, short black hair, a scar across her eyebrow, leather clothing, 2 daggers on her belt. Her eyes were dark and tired. She sat down across from him. She placed the dagger on the table, blade away from her, and said that the Baron could go to hell. She asked if the food was good on his team. Dan, without taking his eyes off the blueprint, replied that Amber cooked for 10 and that there were always seconds. The woman said her name was Kasia Vane, that her class was Shadowblade, level 21, that for 15 years she had been killing people for those who despised her, and that she was tired. Dan looked up. He looked at her. Then he said he needed someone to guard the crew, because soon people more serious than a single mercenary with a dagger would be coming for them. Kasia asked how he knew. Dan replied that he'd taken water from Baron Helvik. The Baron owns the only surviving river in the region. Water is his monopoly, and Dan had just proven that one could do without a river. This was a declaration of war, even if he didn't want to fight. Kasia looked at him for a long time. Then she said that for 50 gold pieces, she would kill him. But for a hot meal and a place to sleep, she would protect him, and that she liked the second option better. Starting that night, Kasia became part of the team. She was different, not like Amber with her quiet care, not like Harin with her precision and silence. Kasia was direct, rough. She said what she thought. She looked at the world like someone who was used to seeing people as targets, and was only now learning to see something else in them. She followed Dan like a shadow. She stood behind him while he worked. She slept at the entrance to the tent. For the first 3 days, the crew was afraid of her. Grant gave her a wide berth. Will the potter wouldn't speak to her at all. But on the fourth day, Cassia wordlessly grabbed the end of a heavy pipe that two diggers couldn't lift. She lifted it with one hand. She placed it in the trench. She dusted off her hands and moved on. From that day on, the crew accepted her. Baron Halvik didn't keep them waiting. A week after Cassia's arrival, 3 men came to Asheford. Not mercenaries. Worse. Officials. A royal inspector with 2 assistants. They presented the city council with a letter signed by the Baron, stating that a certain self-proclaimed master was conducting illegal hydraulic works without a guild license. By the law of the kingdom, any work involving water must be approved by the Guild of Water Mages. Dan had no such approval. He didn't have any documents at all, except for a village certificate of initiation that read, Class, Plumber, Level 1. The inspector summoned Dan to City Hall. Dan arrived, in dirty work pants, with dark circles under his eyes. Cassia stood by the door. The inspector read the charges. Illegal activity, arbitrary action, violation of the guild's monopoly on water supply work, a fine, seizure of property, possible imprisonment. Dan listened in silence. Then he asked one thing. He asked if there was a single specialist with the plumber class in the guild registry. The inspector was taken aback. He checked the papers. No, there wasn't a single plumber in the Water Mages Guild registry, because that class hadn't been issued in 200 years. Dan said that by law, the guild regulates the activities of those classes listed in its registry. His class wasn't listed, so the guild had no jurisdiction over him. The inspector opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the papers, looked at Dan. Then he said the matter required further investigation and that he would report to the Baron. And he left. Cassia later asked where Dan had learned the laws. Dan replied that in a past life, he had spent 4 years obtaining permits to lay storm drains in the Oregon state bureaucracy, and that compared to that, the medieval inspector was a walk in the park. Cassia didn't understand a single word, but nodded respectfully. Work in Asheford continued. The distribution network grew. Every neighborhood got its own branch. Dan rose to the 8th level. The stone was easier to work with. The pipes became thinner and stronger. The joints were tighter. He installed check valves on every branch. Simple ones. A ceramic ball in a stone socket. But they prevented the water from flowing back when the supply was shut off. A small thing. But on a city-wide scale, this small thing saved thousands of liters. Rin watched his every decision. She took notes. She asked why. Why a check valve? Why this exact slope? Why is the pipe diameter larger here than there? Dan explained, patiently, in detail. Because the only thing worse than not building a water system is building it and leaving no one with the knowledge of how it works. Hedin absorbed the information at a speed that made Dan feel uncomfortable. She memorized it on the first try. She calculated elevation changes in her head faster than he could. 2 weeks later, she was already designing the branch lines herself. Dan checked her work and found almost no mistakes. One late night, the two of them sat together over a map of the network. Hedin was sketching out the final section of the southern branch. Dan was pointing out where to place the valve. Their hands accidentally brushed over the map. Both froze for a second. Then Hayden withdrew her hand and continued drawing. Dan continued explaining. Neither of them said a word about it. But Cassia, who was standing by the entrance to the tent, saw everything, and she smiled in the darkness. By the end of the 2nd month, the system was ready. 12 water outlets, 3 storage tanks, a main line with 4 branches. The total length of the network was 1 kilometer 800 meters. The estimated capacity was 12,000 liters per day. That was enough for 15,000 people, with a margin to spare. The city council scheduled the grand opening for market day. Dan wanted to skip the ceremony. He said that the water was already flowing and the ceremony wasn't necessary. Amber, who had returned from Littlebrook, looked at him sternly and said that people needed not only pipes, but also moments. Dan didn't understand. Amber sighed and said he was hopeless. The next day, the crew was finishing the last section of the southern branch, the very one leading to the leper colony. Dan personally installed the final connection, a stone coupling at the junction of 2 pipes. He ran his hand along the seam. Smooth. Airtight. The water will flow. The 27 people behind the southern wall would no longer have to drink from the ditch. He stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees, and saw a girl of about 10 standing at the edge of the trench, one of the lepers, with bandages on her arms. She looked at him silently. Then she asked if it was true that they would have water. Dan said it was true. Tomorrow. The girl turned and ran toward the colony. He heard her shouting as she ran. There will be water. There would be water tomorrow. Dan stood in the trench and watched her go. Grant stood nearby, sniffling. Cassia turned away. Ha-Rin took off her glasses and wiped them. It had become their ritual. Ha-Rin always wiped her glasses when she didn't want anyone to see her eyes. Cassia Wayne joined the team instead of killing Dan on Baron Halvik's orders. The Baron sent a royal inspector, but Dan fought him off legally. Ashford's water supply system is complete. Dan secretly connected the leper colony. Level 8. Ahead lies the grand opening and the capital's growing attention. The day of the grand opening began with trouble. Master Horton took Dan aside an hour before the ceremony and quietly informed him that a representative of the Water Mages Guild from the capital would be attending the opening. Not an inspector, a full-fledged guild assessor, a man with the authority to shut down any water system if it did not meet the guild's standards. Dan asked, "What standards?" Horton spread his hands. "Whatever they say." Dan nodded. He'd expected something like this. The guild couldn't allow a precedent. If some kid with pipes could supply the city with water cheaper than a circle of archmages, then why keep the archmages around? Cassia suggested a simple solution. She said she could make sure the appraiser didn't show up. Dan looked at her and said no. She shrugged. "Just a suggestion," she said. The appraiser arrived around noon, a thin man in his 40s wearing a blue robe with silver embroidery. The guild's symbol on his chest, a water rune. His name was Corvin Tate. Dan didn't yet know that he was standing before an archmage, that this thin man with tired eyes led the entire guild of water mages, that he had come in person not because the small town of Asheford deserved the guildmaster's attention, but because Corvin Tate wanted to see with his own eyes the man who was breaking the system the guild had been building for 40 generations. Tate walked through the town. He inspected the well. He inspected the main pipeline. He tapped on the pipes. He checked the joints. He opened and closed 3 valves. He drew water from a tap. He tasted it. Then he stood silently for 2 minutes, staring at the stone pipe that disappeared into the ground. Dan stood nearby and waited. Tate turned to him. He said the system was primitive, that the materials were crude, that the joints would lose their seal in 10 years, that the capacity could be tripled if water magic were used instead of mechanical pumping. Dan listened. Tate finished listing the flaws and fell silent. Then he said one word. "It works." Dan nodded. Tate said that was exactly what was frightening. Because water magic requires 10 years of training and an innate gift and a reserve of mana and constant support. And this system, made of stone and clay, works on its own. Without a mage, without mana, without anything. Just pipes and a slope, and the water goes where it's told to go. Tate asked if Dan understood what he was doing to the world. Dan replied that he was laying pipes. Tate shook his head. He said that Dan was devaluing 3,000 water mages across the 6 kingdoms. What if every city got a system like this? Then mages would become unnecessary. And when mages become unnecessary, the entire order collapses. Because that order is built on the fact that some classes are more important than others. Take away importance, and you kill the hierarchy. Kill the hierarchy, and chaos begins. Dan looked at Tate and saw a smart man, not evil, not greedy, intelligent, and frightened. Dan said that the people in this city had been drinking dirty water for 3 years, that the children were sick, that the elderly were dying, that the colony beyond the wall drank from the gutter, and that a hierarchy that allows this is not worth preserving. Tate said nothing. He turned and walked back to his carriage. Cassia stood by the wall and watched him go. She said quietly that this man was dangerous. Dan replied that he knew. The ceremony took place at noon, Asheford Central Square. So many people had gathered that the guards blocked off 2 streets. Master Horton gave a speech, long and empty, like all bureaucratic speeches in any world. Then he turned the lever on the main valve. Water flowed, cold, clear, with a soft tinkle against the bronze spout that Dan had installed yesterday, because bronze sounds nicer than stone, and that matters to people. The crowd was silent for a second. Then someone clapped. Then everyone clapped. Dan stood off to the side by the wall, in a work jacket, with clay stains on his knees, with dark circles under his eyes. He didn't climb onto the platform. He didn't give a speech. He just stood there and watched as people drew water, as a mother filled a pitcher, as an old man cupped his hands, as a boy tilted his head back and caught the stream in his mouth. And then Grandma Meg stepped out of the crowd. From Littlebrook. Amber had brought her secretly, hired a wagon, 3 hours down a dusty road. The old woman walked up to the tap, held out her hands, filled them with water, drank, then turned around. She didn't look for Dan. She knew exactly where he was standing. She looked at him across the square, and she spoke softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. She said that for the first time in 60 years, she was drinking water she hadn't had to walk for, and she said thank you. The square fell silent, completely quiet. Even the children stopped screaming. Dan looked at Grandma Meg and couldn't say a word. A lump was in his throat. He just put the pipe down. He just put the pipe down, and the water started flowing. It's elementary. It's basic hydraulic engineering. A well, a main line, piping, check valve, 2-degree slope. Nothing complicated. Why are they all looking at me like that? Kasia was standing by the wall to his right. She turned her back to the wall and was doing something with her face. When she turned back, her eyes were dry, but the scar on her eyebrow was twitching. Ha-Rin stood on the left. She took off her glasses. She wiped them for a long time. A minute, 2. The glasses had been clean for a while, but she kept wiping them. Amber stood in the crowd next to Granny Meg. Redhead, freckled, eyes wet. She looked at Dan and smiled. Grant sniffed, openly, without restraint. Will the potter sat on a barrel, holding a mug of water with both hands. He wasn't drinking, just holding it. Then a man approached Dan, not from the crowd, from the guards. a soldier in uniform. He said the gentleman must go to City Hall. An envoy from the capital was waiting for him there. Dan went. Cassia followed. In the town hall, a man in traveling clothes sat at a table with the royal seal on a leather bag. He stood up when he saw Dan. He introduced himself. An envoy of His Majesty King Arcadian's court. He said that the king had learned of what was happening in Asheford, that the royal council was interested in an audience, that Dan was invited to the capital for a discussion about possible cooperation. Dan asked when. The envoy said that it would be preferable within a month. Dan nodded. The envoy left. Cassia closed the door. Then she turned to Dan and said that the capital was a trap, that the Water Mages Guild was based in the capital, that Baron Halvik had connections at court, that the king's invitation might be a pretext to bring him under their control, or to eliminate him. Dan listened. Then he said she was right, and that he would go. Cassia asked why. Dan replied that 200,000 people lived in the capital, and that their aqueducts were dying too. Cassia was silent. Then she said she would go with him. Dan returned to camp and assembled a team. Amber, Harin, Grant, Cassia. He said they'd leave for the capital in 2 weeks, that Grant would stay in Ashford as head of network maintenance. Nora would continue keeping records. Will the potter would set up pipe production for the future. He explained to Grant how every valve worked, where each reservoir was, which section to check every week. Grant took notes, slowly, in large handwriting, but accurately. Harin left him a copy of the network map with all the markings, every pipe, every joint, every water tap. Grant looked at the map and said he could handle it. Dan believed him. Over those 2 months, the red-haired, strapping lad had gone from a village digger to a master who could be trusted with the system. Before leaving, Dan stopped by the port district. He went down to the basement to see the refugees. Water was running, from a ceramic faucet that wasn't on the official map. The woman who had spoken to him the first time approached. She said they weren't hiding anymore, that the guards had found out about them but had shrugged it off because they now had their own water and weren't stealing from the cistern. That 2 men from their group had found work as porters at the market. That the children were attending the temple school. Dan nodded. Then he asked if the water pressure was enough. The woman laughed. She said there was plenty of pressure and thanked him. Dan said it wasn't him she should thank, but gravity. An 8-meter drop, natural pressure. The woman didn't understand, but she smiled. Dan left the basement. He went up to the street. He stood there for a minute. Then he went to gather his things. Ahead lay the capital. 200,000 people without water. The king. The guild. The baron. People who want to use him or get rid of him. Cassia walked on his right, her hand on the hilt of her dagger. Harin walked on the left, a bag of maps slung over her shoulder. Amber walked behind, with a sack of supplies and an expression that said if her brother forgot to eat again, she'd kill him before any baron could. Dan walked and felt the water beneath his feet. Everywhere. In every direction. Under every field. Under every village. Under every city. Water was everywhere. It just needed a path, and he knew how to make one. Level 10. Hydrosensing radius 400 meters. New material. Bronze. He felt the skill pulsing in his palms. Ready. Waiting. Ahead lay the biggest pipe of his life. And the most important. Corvin Tate had come personally to assess Dan's work and warned that he was breaking a centuries-old hierarchy. At the launch ceremony, Granny Meg from Littlebrook spoke words that moved the entire square. The king invited Dan to the capital for an audience. The team is preparing to leave. Dan has reached the 10th level and gained access to bronze. Ahead lie the capital and politics. The capital of Arcadian was called Whitehall. Dan saw it from a hill 2 hours before sunset. White walls, spires of towers, the dome of the royal palace, and aqueducts. 6 stone thoroughfares stretched toward the city from all sides like the arms of a corpse. 5 of the 6 stood dry. The last one carried a thin stream of brown water. Dan stopped and watched it. Ha-Rin stood beside him. She said quietly that the gnomes had built these aqueducts 300 years ago, that the entire capital had depended on them, and that now they were monuments. Dan said that he didn't see monuments, but 6 lines with 0 flow, and one with a flow rate of 5% of the design capacity. Ha-Rin looked at him over her glasses. Then she took out a notebook and jotted it down. Cassia walked ahead. She knew the capital. She grew up here. Every alley, every dead end, every rooftop from which it's easy to escape. She said they'd be better off staying in the lower bridge district. Not rich, not poor, quiet. Far from the palace and far from the guild tower. Amber asked how much a room cost. Cassia said she had a friend who ran an inn and owed her a favor. Dan didn't ask what kind of favor. They entered the city through the south gate. The guards checked their papers. They looked at the scroll with the invitation from the court. They let them through. Inside the walls, Whitehall turned out to be different from the outside. Beautiful facades hid filthy courtyards. Wide avenues gave way to narrow alleys where the air of urine and rot. And thirst. Dan felt the city's thirst like background noise. People stood in lines at public wells. Long lines. For 3 hours. For 4. Guards made sure no one took more than 2 buckets. At one well, Dan saw a woman with a child in her arms who had been standing there since morning and still hadn't reached the water by evening. He stopped. Cassia tugged at his sleeve. She said they couldn't linger here, that people were watching them. Dan walked on, but he remembered that well, and the woman, and the child. The tavern was called the Copper Mug. The landlady, a large woman named Brenda, she saw Cassia and turned pale. Then she hugged her so tightly that Cassia's ribs cracked. Then she gave them 2 rooms on the 2nd floor, for free, and said there hadn't been any hot water for 6 months. Dan said nothing. In the morning, he put his hand to the floor of the inn and listened for 5 minutes. Then he told Brenda that beneath her, at a depth of 14 meters, there was an aquifer. Brenda looked at him as if he were crazy. Cassia explained to her who he was. Brenda looked at him again. Differently now. Dan said he couldn't drill a well in the capital without a permit. Not now. But he'd keep it in mind. Brenda nodded. The audience was scheduled for the 3rd day. Dan spent the first 2 days scouting. He walked through Whitehall from dawn to dusk. Cassia walked beside him. Ha-Rin walked slightly behind and sketched. The map of the capital she was compiling on the fly was more detailed than anything kept in the city archives. Dan listened to the ground. The aquifers beneath Whitehall were substantial, 3 layers. The top one at a depth of 12 meters, contaminated with sewage, unsuitable. The middle one at 20 meters, good, clean, a large volume. The bottom layer at 40 meters, huge, an entire underground lake. And something else, deeper, much deeper. At 50 meters and below, Dan sensed something strange. Not water, not rock. Something smooth, structured, as if there wasn't rock down there, but something built. He stopped in the middle of the street, closed his eyes, listened. The vibration was coming from below, steady, rhythmic, like a breath, or like the pulse of something very large and very old. Ha-Rin noticed he had frozen. She asked what was wrong. Dan opened his eyes. He said nothing was wrong. Then he said there was something beneath the capital that shouldn't be there. Ha-Rin raised an eyebrow. Dan said he'd tell her once he figured out exactly what it was. She nodded. She didn't press him. He was grateful to her for that. On the third day, Dan put on the clean shirt that Amber had bought for him the day before. Amber looked him over from head to toe. She adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair, said he still looked like a country bumpkin, but at least he was clean. Cassia put on a leather jacket without a dagger. Ha-Rin put on her best clothes, which were no different from her usual ones. A men's shirt, pants, glasses on a chain. They arrived at the palace around 10 in the morning. White marble, columns, guards in golden armor. They were led through 3 halls and 2 corridors, then through the garden, then through another hall, then into a small room with a round table and 6 chairs. 4 people sat at the table. King Theodore IV of Arcadian, a tall man in his 50s with silver temples and weary eyes. His chancellor, Lord Mason, a small, stout man with piercing eyes and slender fingers. The Corps for Water Resources, a woman in a blue robe, the Water Mage. And Corvin Tate, head of the Water Mages Guild. Dan saw him and realized that it wasn't just an appraiser who had come to see him in Asheford. He assessed the situation. The king wants a solution to the water problem. The chancellor wants control. Tate wants to preserve the guild's monopoly. They all want different things, and they're all looking at him. The king spoke first. His voice was even, polite. He said he'd heard about the work in Asheford, that he was impressed, that the kingdom needed a solution to the water crisis, and that he would like to discuss the possibilities. Dan nodded. Then he asked permission to ask a question. The king nodded. Dan asked how many liters of water Whitehall currently received per day. The chancellor replied, about 80,000 liters, from the last functioning aqueduct and from the city wells. Dan asked what the demand was. The chancellor said that according to peacetime standards, it was 400,000 liters. Dan nodded. An 80% shortfall. Then he said that beneath Whitehall, at a depth of 20 meters, there was a lodge capable of yielding 1 million liters a day, that he needed 200 workers and 6 months to build a full-scale water supply system for the entire capital. The room fell silent. The chancellor exchanged glances with Tate. Tate stared at Dan without blinking. The king asked on what terms. Dan said he had 2 conditions. First, the status of an independent master of water with the royal seal, not a baron's serf, not a guild employee, not a court mage, an independent master with the right to recruit a crew and carry out work in any city in the kingdom. The chancellor grimaced. Tate frowned. The king listened. The second condition? Water goes to every neighborhood in the city, including the poor ones, including the slums, including the neighborhoods beyond the southern wall. No exceptions. The chancellor said it was politically difficult. Dan replied that hydraulically, it was elementary. A pipe doesn't distinguish between the poor and the rich. Water flows where the slope leads, and the slope leads down, and the poor neighborhoods are always down below, so they'll get water naturally. This isn't charity, it's physics. Tate spoke for the first time. He said that the guild could not allow uncontrolled construction of water systems by anyone without a guild license, that it would set a precedent, that it was a matter of order. Dan cut him off. For the first time during the audience, he raised his voice, not to a shout, to a firm tone. He said that an order in which 200,000 people drink dirty water is no order, it's a disaster, and that if the guild can provide water to the capital, let it do so, right now, today. He'll wait. Tate was silent, because he couldn't. The guild couldn't. 3,000 water mages across the 6 kingdoms were burning out trying to water the cities with spells. Mana isn't limitless. The heat was consuming it 3 times faster than usual. Archmages were working in shifts and collapsing from exhaustion, and the drought had been going on for 3 years. The king looked at Tate. Tate stared at the table. The king turned to Dan. He said he would accept both conditions. The chancellor began to object. The king raised his hand. The chancellor fell silent. Dan received the seal of the watermaster that very day, a bronze plate bearing the imprint of a crown and a drop of water, a parchment document bearing the king's signature, the right to a 200-man brigade, the right to conduct operations in any city in Arcadian. Cassia looked at the seal. She said that this thing was worth more than everything she had earned in 15 years. Dan put the seal in his pocket and said he would begin his investigations tomorrow. Hadrin was already laying out a map of the capital on the table. Amber was calculating the budget. Dan stood in the middle of the room at the Copper Mug Tavern and looked at his team. 3 women, each in her own world. He needed each of them for different reasons. Hadrin for precision, Cassia for security, Amber for everything else. He thought he needed more people. Lots of people. 200 workers is good, but he needed someone who knew the capital from the inside. Not a map, not the streets, but the people. Who lives where? What makes them tick? Who will steal water from the pipes? Who will break the valves? Who will pay, and who won't? He needed a man from the streets. He found that man the next day. Or rather, that man found him. The team arrived in the capital, Whitehall. Dan discovered powerful aquifers beneath the city and a strange structure deep underground. At an audience with the king, he bargained for the status of an independent water master and the right to a crew. Tate was present in person and lost the first round. Dan begins work in the capital and realizes that he needs someone who knows the city from the inside. May Park appeared on the morning of the second day of work. Dan was marking out the site for the city's first well at the intersection of Copper Street and Laundry Alley. Cassia stood nearby. Hadrin was drawing the reference points. And suddenly, a small figure in a man's cap climbed under the fence and stood right on the markings. Short. 2 short pigtails. A dirty face. Defiant eyes. About 18 years old, but she looked younger. She said that if he was going to lay pipes in this neighborhood, he needed someone who knew which of the neighbors were thieves, which ones drank, and which ones paid on time. Cassia stepped toward her. May didn't flinch. She looked up at Cassia and said she wasn't looking for a fight, but was offering a business partnership. Cassia looked at Dan. Dan looked at May. He asked who she was. She said her name was May Park, that her father was a water hauler, that she grew up on a water barrel, that her class is 8th level water carrier, and that there isn't a single street in this city she doesn't know. Dan asked why she needed this. May answered without a pause. She said that her whole life she'd watched the rich get water delivered to their homes, while her father hauled it to the poor for pennies. That her father worked himself to the bone every day, that his back was already stiff, and that if Dan really intended to provide water to every home in the city, she wanted to be a part of it, because then her father wouldn't have to work himself to the bone. Dan was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said, "You're welcome." May proved invaluable. On the very first day, she compiled a list of 40 homeowners in the neighborhood, with notes. This one pays on time. This one will argue. This one steals from the neighbors. This widow won't pay a thing, but she has 6 children, and it's better not to mess with her because the whole neighborhood feels sorry for her. Dan studied the list and adjusted the route for the first branch. May went door to door and explained to the residents what was going to happen, that they would be digging, that it would be noisy, that in 2 weeks they would have a tap in their yard. Some didn't believe her. May argued with them in their own language, in the language of the streets, sharply, loudly, with such expressions that Cassia once raised an eyebrow. But people listened, because May was one of them, the water carrier's daughter, a girl from the barrel. She knew the value of every bucket. The work in the capital was harder than in Asheford. The scale was different. 200,000 people, dozens of neighborhoods, kilometers of pipes. Dan divided the city into 12 sectors. Each one needed a separate branch from the main line. The main line ran from the main well in the southeast neighborhood through the city center to the northern districts. The total length of the main line was 4 kilometers. Bronze pipes. The 10th level unlocked bronze, and Dan used it to the fullest. Bronze doesn't rust. It doesn't crumble. It's stronger than stone. And it sounds beautiful when water flows through it. 200 workers dug trenches. Grant came from Asheford to lead the excavation crew. He left the network in Asheford in the hands of Nora and 2 local foremen he had trained. Dan shaped pipes 12 hours a day. Manna flowed out like a river. Dehydration became chronic. Amber brought him water every half hour. He drank 20 liters a day. The skin on his hands cracked and wouldn't heal. Dark circles appeared under his eyes that didn't fade by morning. Harin was the first to notice. One evening she approached him and said he was killing himself, that at this pace his body wouldn't last another month. Dan replied that in a month the main line would be ready and the pace would slow down. Harin said that a dead engineer wouldn't help anyone. Dan looked at her. She stood before him, tall, thin, a silvery sheen on the skin of her neck. Her glasses glinted in the light of the oil lamp. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes that made him feel uneasy. He said he would be more careful. She nodded, turned and left. She turned around at the threshold, said that his morning layout drawing contained an error at the 3rd node. The pipe diameter was 2 centimeters too small. The pressure losses wouldn't add up. Dan checked. She was right. He corrected it, and thought that this woman noticed everything. Problems arose in the 3rd week of work. The first problem was political. The Water Mages Guild had launched a campaign, not an open one, a quiet one, whispered, in salons, in taverns, in markets. Rumors. That the plumber's pipes were poisoned, that the water from the well caused illness, that the bronze of the skill contained a curse. May brought these rumors on the 2nd day. She had heard them at the market. 3 market women were discussing how some mage had warned about contaminated pipes. Dan asked May what to do. May said that rumors are fought with words, so they must be fought with words too, but different ones. She suggested conducting a public water inspection. Call a doctor. Let him check it in front of everyone. Dan agreed. The next day, a crowd gathered in the square in front of the well. A doctor from the city hospital, an old healer-class mage. He drew water from the pipe, checked it with a spell, tasted it. He checked for clarity. Then he turned to the crowd and said that this was the purest water he had seen in the capital in the last 5 years. The crowd buzzed. The rumors didn't die out, but they subsided. May then walked through the market and repeated the doctor's words to every vendor, 3 times, in detail. May was a weapon Dan hadn't had before, the voice of the street. The second problem was physical, an assassination attempt. Night, the 3rd week. Dan was working late, alone. Cassia had stepped away for an hour to check the approaches to the camp. Rin, had gone to sleep. Dan was standing by the trench, checking the slope of the final section. An arrow struck a wooden post 1/2 meter from his head. Quiet. Soundless. A crossbow bolt. Dan fell to the ground. A second bolt struck the ground where he had been standing a second ago. There was no third. Cassia appeared 3 minutes later. She saw the bolt in the post, then the second one in the ground, then Dan lying in the trench. She didn't say a word. She vanished into the darkness. She returned an hour later. She said the shooter had fled across the rooftops. A professional, not a street thug. A hired gun. She said that starting tonight, Dan wouldn't be left alone. Ever. Not for a minute. Dan wanted to object. Cassia looked at him in such a way that he kept quiet. From that day on, she slept at the door to his room. Literally. She spread a blanket on the floor and lay across the threshold. Ember saw this and said nothing, but she pressed her lips together. The third problem was an engineering one. In the 4th week, Dan was laying a deep section of the main line through the central district. The trench was 3 meters deep. The soil was dense, clay, gravel, remnants of old foundations. And suddenly the work stopped. One of the digger's shovels struck something hard. Not a rock, not a foundation. Something smooth. Dan climbed down into the trench. He dropped to his knees. He brushed the dirt away with his hands. Beneath the soil was a floor, smooth, dark, with carved symbols. He pressed his palm against the surface, and he almost pulled his hand away. A vibration, strong, deep, as if something were breathing beneath that floor. Something huge. Ha-Rin climbed down to him. She looked at the symbols. She said she'd never seen writing like this before. Dan ran his finger along the carvings. The lines were sharp. Not a single chip, not a single crack, as if carved yesterday. But he felt that this floor was older than the aqueducts, older than the capital, maybe older than the kingdom. He stood up, looked at Ha-Rin, said he'd found that strange thing he'd sensed beneath the city on the first day. Ha-Rin asked what it was. Dan replied that he didn't know, but that it was connected to water. He could feel it. All the vibrations were coming from there, as if the heart of some vast water system lay beneath the capital. Ha-Rin took off her glasses and wiped them. Then she said she would mark the spot on the map. Dan ordered them to backfill that section and dig a trench around it. He didn't want to disturb whatever lay beneath. Not yet, anyway. But he knew he would return here. Because the deeper he dug, the stronger he felt that beneath Whitehall lay the answer to a question he had not yet fully formulated. May Park joined the team as a foreman for working with the city's population. The guild launched a smear campaign, which was successfully countered by a public water inspection. An attempt was made on Dan's life with a crossbow. While laying the main line, he discovered a smooth floor beneath the capital, adorned with carved symbols and emitting a powerful vibration. This first clue to the mystery of the ancient water circuit. Celeste Halvik appeared in the capital during the 6th week of work. Dan hadn't expected her. He knew Baron Halvik had a daughter, Cassia had mentioned her, a water mage, 16th level. The pride of the family, a golden girl with a golden class. But he didn't expect to see her on the doorstep of the Copper Mug Tavern at 7 in the morning, soaked from the rain. The first rain in 3 months. A light, lazy, the kind that doesn't quench the earth's thirst, but only teases it. Celeste stood in the doorway and looked as if she hadn't slept for 2 days. Her light hair was plastered to her forehead. Her expensive raincoat was splattered with mud. Her eyes were red. Her posture was the same, like a violin. Even when tired, she stood so straight that it seemed as if her spine were made of steel. Brenda, the innkeeper, wanted to throw her out. Kasia stepped out from behind the table and placed her hand on the hilt of her knife, because standing before them was the daughter of the man who had hired her to kill Dan. Dan raised his hand. Kasia stopped. Dan asked what she wanted. Celeste spoke. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. She said that a week ago she had been in the village of Rainhill, 2 days' journey west of the capital. Her father had refused to supply water from his river there because Rainhill hadn't paid its tax. Celeste had gone there with a guild caravan to demonstrate water magic, to show the residents that the guild cared, that mages were needed. A propaganda trip. She arrived and saw dead children. 3, 2 girls and a boy. Dehydration. They were 6, 4, and 2 years old. They were buried the day she arrived, in dry ground, without water to wash their bodies, because there wasn't even water for that. Celeste paused. She swallowed. She continued. She said she stood over those graves and thought about her class, level 16 water mage, that she could conjure 200 liters of water an hour, that if she had arrived 3 days earlier, these children would still be alive. But she didn't arrive, because she wasn't sent, because Rainhill didn't pay. Dan listened in silence. Amber stood by the stove and listened too. Ha-Rin sat at the table with a notebook in her hands. May chewed on bread and stared at Celeste without blinking. Celeste said she wanted to study. Not magic. She already knows magic. She wants to study engineering. She wants to understand how Dan provides water without mana, without spells, without mages. Just pipes. Because mages are finite. Mana is finite. But pipes last forever. Dan looked at her. His enemy's daughter. A mage from the world he had destroyed. A girl who had seen dead children and come to the man her father had tried to kill. He said he would take her in, on one condition. She works like everyone else, digs trenches, carries tools, calculation gradients, no privileges. If she made a mistake in her calculations, he would tell her so directly. Celeste nodded. Kasia pulled Dan aside. She said it might be a trap, that the Baron might have sent his daughter as a spy. Dan said it was possible, but that a girl who weeps over dead children doesn't usually play games. Kasia shook her head, but she didn't argue. Celeste started work the next day. The first morning, Dan gave her an assignment, to calculate the pressure losses on the section of the pipeline from node 3 to node 7, 300 meters long, 3 bends, 1 rise, pipe diameter 10 centimeters, material bronze. Celeste looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she asked what pressure loss was. Dan explained, patiently, at length, with examples. Then he gave her the formula. Then he sent her off to calculate. She returned 2 hours later with the result. The result was wrong. She had forgotten to account for the roughness of the pipe's inner wall. Dan pointed out her mistake, explained why it mattered. Celeste listened. Her cheeks were burning. She wasn't used to having her mistakes pointed out. Her whole life she'd been told she was a prodigy, that she was the best, that her magic was perfect. And here was a guy, 3 years her junior, pointing a finger at her calculation and saying that the roughness of the bronze was 0.015, but she'd used 0.01, and that's why everything was wrong. She recalculated. Correct. Dan nodded and gave her the next assignment. A week later, Celeste was calculating faster. 2 weeks later, she was crawling into trenches. 3 weeks later, she was inspecting pipe joints and finding defects the workers had missed. Dan watched her. She was smart, a quick learner, and with each passing day, something in her posture changed. She still stood straight, but it was no longer the stiffness of a baron's daughter. It was the composure of a person who knows why they're here. One evening, Celeste came to Dan with a question. She asked why his system didn't use magic. It could increase the pressure, speed up the purification, reduce losses. Dan said the system had to work without a mage, because a mage might leave, might die, might get sick, and the pipes would remain. Celeste said that was a sad view of the world. Dan replied that it was an engineer's view. The system shouldn't depend on a single person, not even on himself. If he were gone tomorrow, the pipes would have to keep working. The water would have to keep flowing. Celeste was silent for a long time. Then she said that her whole life she had been taught to be irreplaceable, that a mage's value lies in the fact that nothing works without him. Dan replied that an engineer's value lies in the opposite, in the fact that after he's gone, everything works on its own. Celeste left. Dan sat at the table and felt that he had said something important. Not for her, for himself. Because he was thinking about what lay beneath the capital, about the smooth floor with symbols, about the vibrations, about the ancient circuit, and about how, 200 years ago, someone had broken a system that worked on its own, and replaced it with mages who cannot work without mana, dependence instead of freedom. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Someone's choice. And Den was beginning to understand whose. Work on the main line was in full swing. By the end of the second month, 4 of the capital's 12 sectors were connected. 80,000 people had access to water. The lines at the wells grew shorter. Bathhouses in 2 neighborhoods opened for the first time in a year. City guard soldiers were able to wash up after their shift for the first time in 6 months. One of them met Dan on the street, a burly man in chainmail. He stopped him, took off his helmet, and said thank you. Said that his wife had washed his shirt in clean water for the first time in a year. Dan nodded and walked on. Kasha walked beside him, smiling. May ran ahead. She was negotiating with the landlords of the next block about connecting the water. She was arguing, bargaining, making promises, making threats. She was doing what Dan couldn't, talking to people in their own language. Level 12. The skill had granted a new ability, pipe diagnostics. Dan could now sense the condition of any pipe within range. Cracks, clogs, leaks. Like a doctor listening to a pulse, he walked through the completed sections and found 3 micro-cracks at the joints. Fixed them in an hour. Ha-Rin marked all the defects on the map. She kept technical documentation for the entire system. Every pipe, every junction, every valve. With numbers, with dates, with specifications. Dan told her that in his world, this was called as-built documentation. Ha-Rin didn't understand what his world was, but she remembered the term. The 12th level gave her something else. The radius of her hydrosensing had grown to 600 meters, and now Dan could feel that strange floor beneath the capital from all around. It lay at a depth of 50 meters, huge, smooth, alive. A vibration emanated from it constantly, like a pulse, and Dan felt that this pulse was weakening, slowly, year after year, decade after decade. Something beneath the capital was dying. And when it finally died, Dan didn't know what would happen, but he suspected it wouldn't be anything good. Celeste Halvik joined the team after seeing children die of dehydration in a village her father had denied water to. Dan is teaching her engineering and she's learning fast. 4 sectors of the capital are connected to the water supply. Level 12. Dan realizes that someone deliberately replaced the functioning infrastructure with a reliance on mages. The pulse beneath the capital is fading. She was waiting for him underground. Dan stumbled upon the entrance by accident. It was his 5th month working in the capital. He was drilling the city's third well in the eastern sector, 25 meters deep. His skill shaped the shaft, the rock parted, and suddenly, the floor. That very same smooth floor with symbols. Only this time, there was a crack in it. Narrow, 30 centimeters, but wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Dan felt air from below, warm, damp, with a scent he'd never smelled before, like water and stone and something alive. He called Cassia. Cassia climbed down the ladder into the shaft. She looked at the crack. She said she would go first. Dan didn't argue. Cassia squeezed through the crack and disappeared. Silence. A minute. 2. Then her voice from below, muffled, distant. She said there was a hall here, a big one, and that there was someone here. Dan crawled in after her. The crack turned out to be the entrance to a vertical shaft, 3 meters down. Then the hall. He jumped down onto the floor and stood up. The hall was huge. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls were covered with the same carved symbols. They glowed faintly, blue, like water in moonlight. And water was flowing down the walls, not dripping, flowing, in thin, even streams through channels carved into the stone. The system of channels covered the walls like blood vessels. Dan looked at it and felt something resonate inside him. A skill. Hydrosense. It was screaming, not with words, with sensation, as if he had finally found something familiar, something that spoke the same language. Cassia stood with her dagger at the ready. She pointed to the far end of the hall. There, in the semi-darkness, stood a figure, motionless, white, barefoot. A woman, dark hair down to her waist, white clothes, bare feet on wet stone. She stood and looked at them. She didn't move, didn't blink, like a statue. Cassia stepped forward, dagger in hand. The woman spoke. The language was unfamiliar, ancient, but her skill translated it, as if the water in the walls whispered the meaning of the words. She said she had been waiting a long time. Dan asked who she was waiting for. She said the one who hears the water like them. Dan asked who they were. She said they were the guardians. That her name was So Do Yun. That she was the last priestess of the cult of the old water, that she had been living in this hall for a very long time. Dan asked how long. Do-yun paused. Then she said she didn't remember, that the years underground flowed like water, formless, countless. Maybe 10 years, maybe 50, maybe more. Cassia cursed under her breath. Dan took a step forward. Cassia grabbed his shoulder. He gently removed her hand and walked toward Do-yun. He stopped 3 steps away. He looked at her. A young face, but old eyes. Very old, like bottomless wells. He asked what she was guarding. Do-yun turned and walked deeper into the hall. Dan followed. Cassia followed him, her hand on her dagger. They walked for 10 minutes down a corridor that grew wider and lower. The water on the walls flowed faster. The channels grew thicker, the symbols brighter. And then the corridor ended. Dan stepped to the edge and stopped. Before him was emptiness, a huge vertical well plunging down into the darkness. The walls of the shaft were covered with pipes, bronze, thick, hundreds of pipes. They went down and branched out like the roots of a tree. Some were intact, some were torn. Water oozed from the breaks. Slowly, drop by drop. Dan stood at the edge and looked down, and for the first time in this world, he felt awe. He was looking at an engineering structure, not a temple, not a palace, a system. A gigantic hydraulic system that once did something unimaginable, and which was broken. Do-yun stood beside him. She said this was the heart of the circuit, that 300 years ago it had sustained the entire continent, regulated the rivers, directed underground currents, maintained the water balance from sea to sea, without mages, without mana. Just pipes. Dan closed his eyes. Just pipes. He opened his eyes and asked who had broken it. Do-yun said she didn't know the name. She only knew that 200 years ago a man came, a mage. He severed the central coupling at the very bottom, and after that, the architect goddess introduced the class system, to replace the infrastructure with people, so that every city would depend not on pipes, but on mages, so that power would be in hands, not in the ground. Dan asked why. Do-yun looked at him, for a long time. Then she said that whoever controls water controls life. Pipes answer to no one. Mages answer to the guild. The guild answers to the king. The king answers to fear, a vicious circle. Dan stood at the edge of the well and thought. This whole world, classes, hierarchy, guilds, the initiation ceremony, none of this was a gift from the goddess. It was a patch, a temporary solution, one that became permanent, one that became the only option. And now, as the old circuit was finally dying, the patch wasn't holding either. The drought wasn't a curse. The drought was a symptom. Dan turned to Do-yun. He asked if the circuit could be repaired. Do-yun said that theoretically, yes. If the central coupling were replaced and the broken pipes restored, the circuit would restart. But for that, they needed someone who could work with a system of that scale. Someone whose skill was compatible with the ancient pipes. Dan looked at his hands. The hands of a 16-year-old boy, with skin cracked from dehydration, with calluses from tools. A plumber. A class that hadn't been granted in 200 years, because the last person to receive it found this hall, and was killed before he could realize what he had found. Dan asked Do-yun if she had a plan to evacuate the source in case the vault collapsed. Do-yun froze. Then she looked at him as if he had said something impossible. Then she laughed quietly. For the first time in a very long time, judging by how unfamiliar her laughter sounded. She said she had been waiting for a great sage, but a tired guy in dirty boots showed up, and the first thing he asked about was evacuation. Dan shrugged. He said that safety is the first thing. Second is material consumption. Third is deadlines. He asked how deep the central coupling was. Do-yun said it was about 100 meters from where they were standing. Dan whistled. 100 meters down a vertical shaft with broken pipes and unstable walls. He asked how much time they had. Do-yun paused. Then she said the circuit was fading, that the vibration was weakening every year, that in 2, maybe 3 years, it would stop completely. And then the aquifers across the entire continent would start to dry up. Not from the top like now, from the bottom. Forever. Dan nodded. Then he said he needed to go up, that he needed to finish the water main in the capital, gain levels, get materials he didn't have yet, and come back here with a team. Do-yun asked if he would return. Dan looked into her eyes. Dark, bottomless, like that well behind him. He said he would return, because there's a broken coupling down there, and he's a plumber. And fixing couplings is literally why he's here. Do-yun nodded, and for the first time during their conversation, She smiled. Not with laughter, a smile. Quiet, like water in the moonlight. Dan and Cassia went back upstairs. Cassia was silent the whole way. Only when they climbed out of the shaft onto the surface and saw the sky did she say one sentence. She said that this world was more complicated than she thought. Dan replied that water is always more complicated than it seems. Dan fell into an underground chamber and met So Do-yun, the last priestess of the cult of the old water. She showed him the heart of the contour, a gigantic, ancient hydraulic system that once fed the entire continent and was deliberately broken 200 years ago. The drought is a consequence of the dying contour. The plumber class is the key to repairing it. Dan has 2 or 3 years. Dan returned upstairs and told no one except Kasha. Not because he didn't trust the team, because information about the ancient contour was more dangerous than a crossbow bolt. If the Water Mages Guild found out that beneath the capital lay a system capable of replacing all mages at once, they wouldn't just try to kill Dan, they would try to destroy the contour completely, so that no one could ever repair it. Kasha agreed. She said silence was the best shield. Dan worked. His 6th month in the capital. 8 sectors connected. 130,000 people with water. The main line stretched 6 kilometers. Bronze pipes, 42 water outlets, 6 storage tanks, 2 lever pumps and 1 water lift on the Sylvan River, which still carried its pitiful trickle. Level 15. The skill now provided hardened steel. Steel pipes for the mains, steel valves, steel check valves, 10 times stronger than bronze, and a new ability, remote control of the valves. Dan could now open and close any valve within the skill's range simply by force of will. A trifle at first glance, but on a city-wide scale it meant he could redirect flows in seconds. Shut down a damaged section, transfer pressure to another branch. The entire system became an extension of his nervous system. The guild wasn't giving up. Corvin Tate returned to the capital after a 2-month absence. He called a guild meeting, a closed one. Cassia found out about it through her contacts. 43 water mages from the 6 kingdoms. They discussed the plumber's problem. That's what they called it, the plumber's problem. Tate proposed 3 options. First, integrate Dan into the guild. Give him a title. Keep him within bounds. Second, discredit him. Prove that his system is unreliable and dangerous. The third, it wasn't spoken aloud, but everyone understood. Cassia said the third option was the most likely. Dan said he would take it into account. Then he asked Cassia to stop following him around like a shadow, at least not into the bathroom. Cassia replied that she wouldn't. May brought news from the street. A preacher had appeared in the city, a skinny man in gray rags with wild eyes. He stood in the square and shouted that the drought was a purification, that the gods were punishing people for their sins, that whoever gave out water was interfering with the gods, that water from the pipes was cursed. May asked what to do about him. Dan said nothing. Let him shout. May looked at him doubtfully. Dan explains that 1 preacher is a madman. 10 preachers are a movement. If they start persecuting him, they'll turn him into a martyr. Better to give people water and let them decide for themselves who to believe, the pipes or the madman in the square. May snorted. Then she said that Uncle knew how to think. Dan winced at the word uncle. He was 27 in his past life, 16 in this one. He wasn't anyone's uncle. But May didn't care. By the 7th month, Dan had finished the 10th sector. 2 remained, the North Quarter, the richest district in the city, and the West Quarter, the poorest. The North Quarter presented an unexpected problem. The nobility didn't want a shared water supply. They wanted individual connections, separate pipes to every house, with filtration, with heating, with higher pressure than the commoners had. Chancellor Lord Mason came to see Dan in person. He said that if the nobility didn't get a privileged connection, they would block the laying of the main line through their lands. Dan listened. Then he said one thing. He said that the water system operates according to the laws of physics, not the laws of hierarchy. That the pressure in the system is determined by elevation differences, not the size of one's wallet. That if he gave the northern district higher than normal pressure, the southern districts would be left without water. The chancellor said the southern districts didn't concern him. Dan said they concerned him. The chancellor left. Dan knew this would cause him trouble, but math doesn't lie. A pipe doesn't distinguish between the poor and the rich. Celeste solved this problem, unexpectedly. She came to Dan that evening and said she could talk to 3 families from the Northern District. She grew up in those circles. She knows their language. She knows what matters to them. She suggested not arguing with them, but giving them what they want. Not privileges. The appearance of privileges. Bronze faucets instead of steel ones. Decorative rosettes on the water outlets. A separate entrance for the servants so the aristocrats wouldn't have to stand in line with the commoners. The same pipe, same water pressure, same water, but wrapped in pretty paper. Dan looked at her. Then he said she'd learned more than just engineering. Celeste smiled slightly, the first real smile he'd seen from her. She spoke with 3 families, then with 5, then with 12. A week later, the northern quarter agreed to the connection, with bronze faucets and decorative outlets. Dan installed 1 extra shutoff valve and 1 extra filter that didn't change anything in the system, but looked like special perks. The authorities were satisfied. The Western District got hooked up without any problems. The poor don't argue when they're given water. In the 8th month of work in the capital, Dan finished the last sector. The entire system was up and running. 200,000 people. 52 sectors. 8 kilometers of mains. 64 water distribution points. 12 reservoirs. Estimated capacity? 1 million liters per day. The city breathed again. Bathhouses opened in every neighborhood. Laundromats started operating. The fountains in the squares were flowing again. People no longer had to stand in line for 4 hours. The woman with the child, whom Dan had seen on the first day, was now filling up with water on the porch of her house in 2 minutes. Dan reached the 18th level. The skill offered an enchanted alloy, but for that he needed the 20th. 2 levels. He felt that the enchanted alloy was within reach, an alloy that purifies water as it flows, removes salts, heavy metals, pathogens. It would be perfect for repairing the contour. The ancient pipes down below were made of a similar material. He could feel it. Amber gave him a real earful, a proper one, the first ever. She found out that Dan had spent his entire monthly stipend from the city council on ordering special bronze for a pressure reducer. She stood in front of him with her hands on her hips and told him he had no winter clothes, that his boots were full of holes again, that he slept 4 hours a day, that the skin on his hands was cracking and he had dark circles under his eyes like a raccoon. Dan listened. Then he said that the regulator was important, because without it, the pressure at the 3rd node would be unstable. Amber said she wasn't talking about the regulator, but about him. Dan opened his mouth, closed it. It was exactly the same phrase she'd said to him during his first week in Littlebrook. "I'm not talking about the well, I'm talking about you." He looked at her, redhead, freckled, angry, with wet eyes. He said he'd buy some boots. Amber said she'd already bought them. She pulled a pair of new boots from behind her back. Leather, warm, with reinforced soles. Dan took them, put them on, looked at his feet, then at Amber, said thank you. Amber turned away, mumbled that dinner was in an hour and that if he was late, she'd give his portion to Cassia. Dan smiled, his first real smile in a month. He stood in his warm boots in the room of the copper mug and thought about how in a few months he would have to descend 100 meters underground to repair the heart of a dead system that someone had broken 200 years ago. That he needed level 30, enchanted alloy, a team he could trust with his life, and a plan. But right now, he had warm boots, and dinner in an hour, and a sister who scolded him because she cared, and that was enough. For today, that was enough. Dan had completed the capital's water supply system. All 12 sectors are connected. 200,000 people have water. The guild continues its resistance. The cult of thirst begins preaching in the squares. Celeste had learned politics and helped connect the aristocratic quarter. Dan had reached level 18. Ahead lay a series of levels up to 30 and preparation for the descent into the broken contour. 9 months after the initiation. Dan stood in the throne room of Whitehall before the ambassadors of the 6 kingdoms and thought about pipes. Not about politics, not about diplomacy, about pipes. Because the ambassadors had come to discuss the Water Charter, a document that was supposed to define the rules for water distribution among the states. And Dan knew that no document would solve the problem until the contour was repaired. But he couldn't say that. So he stood there and listened as the 6 ambassadors argued over percentages and votes and areas of responsibility. King Theodore sat on the throne and looked tired. Chancellor Mason took notes. Tate stood by the wall and watched. Dan spoke last. He proposed not dividing the water, but building systems. In every kingdom, beneath every city, there are aquifers. There's no need to transport water across the surface. We need to extract it from underground. He can train crews, send his people to every capital. In 2 years, every kingdom will have an independent water supply system. The ambassadors exchanged glances. The ambassador from Greendale asked what the cost would be. Dan said it would be labor and materials, and one condition. Water goes to every city, to every town, to every village. No exceptions, no privileges. The ambassador of Cormain laughed. He said that was naive, that resources are finite, that there will always be someone without water. Dan replied that resources are finite if you think of them as resources. But water underground isn't a resource. It is a system, and systems operate by different rules. A pipe does not run dry just because water has flowed through it. It remains, and tomorrow more will flow through it. Ambassador Cormain fell silent. King Theodore rose. He said that Arcadian would sign the charter on the Watermaster's terms. 5 of the 6 ambassadors signed that very day. The 6th, Ambassador Vulton, he refused. Vulton was the kingdom of Baron Halvik. More precisely, the Baron had enough influence at the court of Vulton to block the signing. Dan had expected this. He nodded. He said the door was open when they were ready, and he left. Kasha met him in the hallway. She said that Tate had been following him all day. Dan said he knew. Then he said they needed to prepare for the descent. A year had passed. Dan had been working non-stop. He sent teams to the 3 kingdoms. Grant led the group in Greendale. Nora went with him to keep records. Will the Potter taught local craftsmen how to make pipes. May stayed in the capital. She managed the city network's maintenance. An 18-year-old girl in a cap commanded 40 workers, and not one of them dared to contradict her, because she knew every faucet in the city by name. Literally. She gave the faucets names. The faucet at Brenda's bakery was called Fatso because it had the strongest flow. The faucet in the Port District was called Stubborn because the valve jammed once a week. Celeste had grown up. Not physically, professionally. She understood hydraulics better than any member of the crew. She had learned to combine her water magic with engineering solutions. Her water purification spell worked 10 times more effectively if the water was run through a properly calculated filtration stage. Dan told her she was the world's first magi engineer. Celeste smiled and replied that it sounded ridiculous, but her eyes sparkled. Ha-Rin had finished a complete map of Arcadian's underground water resources. 3 months of work, 600 sheets. Every aquifer, every underground stream, every cavity. It was a map that had never existed in the history of this world. Dan looked at it and saw not a map, but the continent's nervous system. And he saw it dying. The aquifers in the southern regions were drying up, slowly, but steadily. Do-Yun was right. The circuit was fading. Level 22, still a long way from 30. Dan realized he wouldn't have enough time to gain levels through his regular job. He needed a project larger than the city water system. The first interstate highway. A pipeline from Arcadian to Greendale, through the mountain pass, 80 kilometers. No one had ever built anything like that. Ever. He presented the project to the king. Theodore looked at the blueprints for 10 minutes. Then he asked how much it would cost. Dan named the figure. Theodore turned pale. Chancellor Mason began to calculate. Dan said the pipeline would pay for itself in 3 years, that Greendale would pay for water transit, that the pass would provide access to mountain springs that had been inaccessible until now. Theodore signed off on it. Work began in the first month of the second year. 500 workers, 20 crews, camps every 10 kilometers. Amber oversaw the logistics for the entire operation. She had transformed from a girl who cooked soup for 6 into a logistics officer who fed and supplied an army. She kept track of every nail, every sack of grain, every horseshoe. Dan once asked where she'd learned to do that. Amber replied that she'd spent her whole life counting the coins in her purse to make them last until the end of the week. Big numbers work the same way. There are just more zeros. The pipeline took 4 months to build. Dan laid 3 kilometers of pipe a day. Steel pipe. At the pass where the temperature fell below 0, he used double-walled pipes with an air gap, protection against freezing. An idea from a past life. In Portland, that's how they insulated water pipes in the suburbs. Ha-Rin walked ahead of the crew and marked out the route. Her maps were flawless. Not a single extra meter. Not a single unnecessary turn. The shortest route with the optimal gradient. Cassia ensured safety. Gangs were active on the pass. Deserters, former soldiers, hungry people who robbed caravans. Cassia had made a deal with their leader. Dan didn't ask exactly how, but the gangs didn't touch a single crew. Moreover, 12 former deserters joined the work groups for food and clean water. The level rose quickly. Every kilometer of the highway provided experience. 25, 27, by the end of the mountain pass section, 29. Dan felt his skill expanding. The radius of his hydro-sensing was 2 versts. He could hear underground rivers behind the mountain range. He sensed the glaciers on the peaks. He knew the location of every drop of water within a 2-kilometer radius. The main line began operating in early autumn of the second year. Water from the mountain springs flowed through the pass into Arcadian. Pure, cold. 100,000 liters a day. Greendale received a branch line. Both kingdoms breathed a sigh of relief. King Theodore sent a messenger with a letter of thanks. Dan used the letter as a bookmark for his notebook of calculations. Amber saw this and took the letter away. She said that royal letters aren't used as bookmarks. Dan said it was the perfect size. Amber hid the letter in a chest and handed him a scrap of leather to use as a bookmark. Level 30 arrived on the day Dan installed the final valve on the Greendale branch. He felt it like a wave of heat. The skill activated. Enchanted alloy. A metal that didn't exist in this world. Silvery. Light. 20 times stronger than steel. And alive. Pipes made of this alloy purified water as they moved, removed everything. Salts, metals, bacteria, magical impurities. Dan formed the first piece of enchanted alloy in his palm. It was warm, and it hummed, a thin, high-pitched sound, like a tuning fork. Dan closed his eyes and realized that this sound matched the vibration of the contour. The same tone, the same frequency. The alloy was made of the same material as the ancient pipes. He was ready. The water charter had been signed by 5 of the 6 kingdoms. Dan had built the first interstate highway through the mountain pass. Crews were working in 3 kingdoms. The team had grown professionally. Level 30 had been reached. The enchanted alloy had been unlocked. Dan is ready to descend into the contour. Dan gathered the team at the Copper Mug Tavern 3 days before the descent. Everyone was there. Amber, Harin, Cassia, Celeste, May. He closed the door, sat down at the table, and told them everything. About the underground hall, about Do Yun, about the heart of the contour, about the broken coupling, about how the drought isn't a whim of the weather, but the agony of an ancient system, about how the plumber class was revealed 200 years ago, and that man was killed, about how they might have a year before the contour stops completely and the aquifers start drying up from below. The table was silent. Amber stared at him with wide eyes. Harin sat motionless. Only the tips of her fingers on her glasses turned white. Cassia leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. May chewed on her lip. Celeste turned pale. Cassia was the first to speak. She asked how many people were needed for the descent. Dan said 4. Him, Cassia for defense, Harin for navigation, and Do-yun as a guide. Celeste said she had to go, that her water magic might be needed down there. Dan shook his head. He said they needed Celeste up here, that going down was a risk, that if the vault collapsed, someone would hold the barrier from above so the destruction wouldn't reach the city. Celeste was the only one on the team who could cast a magical shield over the work zone. Celeste wanted to argue. Dan looked at her. She fell silent. She nodded. Amber asked what she should do. Dan said that if something went wrong down below, flooding could start up above. The old contour canals run under half the capital. If the contour restarts uncontrollably, water will pour into the basements, into the foundations, into the lower districts. Someone has to organize the evacuation. Amber nodded. She was already calculating in her head. Routes, people, carts, time. May asked what she should do. Dan said that May knew every street in the city, that she should go through all the lower neighborhoods and warn people. No panic, no explanations. Just tell them that flooding was possible and that it was better to be prepared. May said she understood. She stood up, put on her cap, and left. Dan watched her go and thought that this girl never asked unnecessary questions. She just did. It took 3 days to prepare. Dan went down to Do-yun twice. They discussed the route. A vertical shaft, 100 meters down ruined staircases and through the debris of old pipes. Do-yun said she had gone down many times, but never further than 50 meters. Below that, the walls were unstable. Water seeped through. Pieces of pipe fell. Dan asked why she hadn't tried to fix it herself. Do-yun looked at him and said her class was guardian, not a builder. She can talk to water. She can feel its memory. But she can't shape metal. She can't lay pipes. She can't replace a coupling. That's where he comes in. Dan nodded. On the morning of the 3rd day, He stood at the entrance to the shaft. Dawn, cold air, autumn. Cassia stood nearby, 2 daggers, a rope, torches. Hei-rin stood on the other side, a bag of drawing tools, rolled up sheets of blank paper, charcoal pencils. She would map the way down, every meter, every turn, every crack. Celeste stood on the surface, her hands raised, a blue glow around her fingers. She had already begun to form a barrier over the work zone, thin, transparent, but sturdy. Amber stood a little way off. She looked at Dan. He looked at her. She didn't say a word. She just handed him a flask of hot tea. He took it, took a sip, handed it back. Amber clutched the flask with both hands and turned away. Dan climbed into the shaft. Cassia followed him. Ha-rin was last. Do-yun waited below, in white clothes, barefoot, with a torch in her hand that burned without fire, a blue flame, a watery light. She led them down. The descent was difficult. The stairs were destroyed. They had to climb the walls, clinging to the remains of pipe brackets. Cassia moved like a lizard, quickly, confidently, not a single wasted movement. Ha-rin climbed more slowly, but didn't stop. Dan walked, feeling the walls, every pipe, every crack, every drop of water seeping from the fissures. 20 meters down, the walls grew damp. 30. Water streamed down the stone in rivulets. 40. The air grew warm and thick. 50 meters. Here began the zone that Do-yun had never ventured into. The walls narrowed. The pipes on the walls were thicker, older. Some still held pressure. Dan could feel the water inside them. Stagnant. 300 years without movement. But alive. Do-yun stopped. She said that beyond this point, the water remembers. Dan asked what that meant. Do-yun pressed her palm against the wet wall and closed her eyes. Then she said that the water in these pipes holds images of those who passed through here before, of those who built, of those who destroyed. Dan placed his palm next to hers. He didn't expect anything, but his skill responded. His hydrosensing kicked into full gear, and he saw. Not with his eyes, with that sixth sense the architect goddess had given him. He saw a man, an old man, in a robe, with a staff. 200 years ago, this man stood here and walked down, toward the central coupling. Dan saw him as a blurred, watery image, like a reflection in a river. The man reached the coupling. He took a tool from his robe, long, metal, and began to turn it, to unscrew it. The coupling. The central coupling that connected the two halves of the contour, the upper and lower. He unscrewed it and removed it. And the moment the coupling came out of its socket, the entire contour shuddered. The water stopped. For the first time in 1,000 years. Dan pulled his hand back. He was breathing heavily. Cassia grabbed his shoulder. He said he'd seen it. Seen who and how the contour had been broken. Hei-rin asked who. Dan said he didn't know the name, but he knew one thing. The coupling hadn't been destroyed. It had been carefully removed. By the threads. Professionally, as if the person who did it was also an engineer. Do-yun nodded. She said that person was the last plumber, before Dan. Dan froze. A plumber broke the circuit? A person with the same rank as him? Why? Do-yun said she didn't know, that water doesn't remember motives, only actions. They continued their descent. Dan told the team the whole truth about the contour. He assigned roles for the operation. He began the descent with Cassia and Heirin. Do-yun is leading them down. At 50 meters, Dan saw in the water's memory that the contour had been broken by the previous plumber 200 years ago. The motive is unknown. The descent continues toward the central coupling. 70 meters. The well widened into a cave. The walls were covered with bronze pipes as thick as a human body. They intertwined like tree roots. Some were intact, some were torn. Water flowed from the breaks. It didn't drip, it flowed, slowly, like blood from an old wound. Dan could sense every pipe, their condition, their internal pressure, their age. 1,000 years. These pipes had been here for 1,000 years, and the material they were made of was that very same enchanted alloy Dan had just learned to create. He ran his hand along the nearest pipe, warm, humming, the same tone as his alloy on his palm, as if the pipes recognized him. Harin was drawing as they went. Her hands moved across the paper quickly and precisely. The map of the dungeon took shape on the sheet, as if she were seeing it from above. Every pipe, every turn, every fork. Cassia walked ahead, daggers in her hands, eyes accustomed to the darkness. She was the first to spot the trap, an old one, a mechanical one, a slab in the floor that gave way under weight. 200 years ago, someone had set it here. Cassia walked around the slab and marked its location on the wall with her knife. Harin marked it on the map. Do-yun walked barefoot on the wet stone, making not a sound, like a ghost in white. She spoke little, but when she did, her words hit the mark. She said that the plumber had set the trap 200 years ago, so that no one would reach the coupling after him. Dan asked why he would break something he could have fixed. Do-yun said that sometimes people break things not out of malice, but out of fear. Dan didn't understand, but he remembered. 80 meters. Heat. 100% humidity. The air felt like a wet blanket. Dan was breathing heavily. His skin was wet. His clothes were stuck to his body. Mana was being spent just to maintain his sense of hydration. He was conserving it. Every drop of energy. He'd need it down below. Cassia wasn't sweating. Dan sometimes thought she wasn't quite human. Harin was sweating, but didn't complain. Her glasses were fogging up. She wiped them every 3 minutes. She kept drawing. 90 meters. The corridor narrowed to a passageway barely wide enough to squeeze through sideways. The walls were vibrating. The rumbling grew louder, low, bass-like, as if they were approaching the heart of a living creature. And suddenly, the passage ended. Dan stepped into the hall and stopped. Before him stood the heart of the contour. He had seen it from above when Do-yun showed him the well, but from above it was just a dark hole with pipes running along the walls. From below, it was different. A bronze structure the size of a cathedral, a sphere, a perfect sphere made of an enchanted alloy, 30 meters in diameter. Thousands of pipes entered it from all sides, like arteries into a heart. The sphere was covered in symbols, the same ones as on the floor upstairs and on the walls of the corridors. They glowed, dimly, blue, like a dying flame. And in the center of the sphere, at eye level, Dan saw it. A hole, round, 40 centimeters in diameter, the socket of the central coupling. Empty. Empty for 200 years. Water oozed from the socket, drop by drop, like tears. Dan approached. He stood before the sphere. He pressed both palms against the metal, and nearly fell. Information flooded into him like a torrent, through his skill, through hydrosensation. He saw the entire system, the entire contour. From this hall to every river on the continent, a network of pipes stretching in all directions for hundreds of kilometers. Main arteries, branches, nodes, valves, flow regulators. A system that once controlled every drop of water on this patch of land. Rivers, lakes, underground streams, rain. It was all part of a single design, and all of it was broken. A single coupling removed, a single rupture at the center, and 1,000 years of work had turned into a dead monument. Dan pulled his hands away. He was unsteady on his feet. Cassia steadied him. Harin looked at the sphere with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Awe. Pure, childlike awe. She said it was the biggest thing she'd ever seen, and the most beautiful. Dan agreed. Then he sat down on a wet rock and began to calculate. A coupling, 40 centimeters in diameter, about a meter long, enchanted alloy, threads, seals. He can do this. His level is sufficient. His skill can create a coupling from enchanted alloy. But there's a problem. A coupling isn't just a piece of pipe. It's the connecting element between the two halves of the circuit, the upper half that collects water from the surface, and the lower half that distributes it across the continent. If he installs the coupling and turns it, the water will flow, all of it, at once. 300 years of pressure built up in the dead pipes. It would be like a dam bursting, only from the inside, from below. He turned to Do-Yun. He asked if it was possible to start the circuit gradually. Do-Yun shook her head. She said the circuit works as a single unit, either all of it or nothing. The coupling is a switch. Flip it and the system starts up. Dan nodded. So they needed to prepare above ground. He pulled a small piece of bronze with an engraved rune from his pocket. Amber had given it to him before they descended. A communication amulet, homemade, 1 kilometer range. But they were 100 meters deep, right beneath the work zone. It should be enough. He activated the amulet. A crackle, noise, then Amber's voice, distant, anxious. Dan told her they were down here, that he'd found the coupling, that he could fix it, but that when he turned the valve up top, flooding might start, that Amber should begin evacuating the lower quarters, now. Amber's voice turned businesslike. She said she understood. The amulet fell silent. Dan knew that Amber was already running, that May was already pounding on doors, that Celeste was already reinforcing the barrier. He turned toward the sphere. Crouched down in front of the empty socket and began to work. The team had reached the heart of the contour at a depth of 100 meters, a gigantic bronze sphere with thousands of pipes. The central coupling had been missing for 200 years. Dan saw the entire continental scale system through his skill. He could create a new coupling from enchanted alloy. But the restart would be instantaneous and could flood the lower districts of the capital. Amber was beginning the evacuation above. Dan set to work. Dan worked. He knelt before the heart of the contour and shaped the coupling from enchanted alloy. His hands moved slowly, precisely. Every movement was measured, every millimeter calculated. The skill sang in his palms. Metal was born from the air, silvery, warm, humming. The body of the coupling took shape, a cylinder, a wall 2 centimeters thick, a thread. Dan carved it with a precision that would make a lathe jealous. The thread pitch matched the socket in the sphere. He could feel it. His skill read the old thread in the socket and formed a matching one on the coupling. Like a key to a lock. An hour of work, the coupling's body was ready. Dan felt the mana draining away. Fast. Too fast. Dehydration had begun. The skin on his hands had grown dry. His lips were chapped. His eyes burned. Cassia handed him a flask. He took a sip. He continued. The seals. 4 rings made of a highly elastic alloy. He formed them one by one. Each ring settled into a groove on the body of the coupling. Tightly. Without a gap. When he screwed the coupling into the socket, the rings would expand and create a sealed connection. The theory was simple. The practice was more difficult. 2 hours of work. The seals were ready. His mana was running out. Dan felt his body losing moisture. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurring. Ha-Rin stood nearby, handing him tools. Silently. Precisely. Like a surgical assistant. She could see he was at his limit, but she said nothing, because she knew he wouldn't stop. 3 hours. The coupling was almost ready. The hardest part remained. the internal channels, the system of openings inside the coupling through which water from the upper half of the contour must flow into the lower half. Not just flow correctly, with the right pressure, with the right flow rate, with the right distribution across the sectors. Dan calculated in his head elevation differences, friction losses, channel cross-sections, flow rates. He was keeping 32 variables in his head at once. Just like in his best project in Portland, when he designed the storm sewer junction at the intersection of 4 streets. Only here, the scale was 1,000 times greater, and the cost of a mistake was 1,000 times higher. 4 hours. The channels were formed. Dan checked each one, ran his finger along every opening. Smooth, clean, correct. He lifted the coupling. Heavy. 20 kilograms. An enchanted alloy denser than steel. He held it up to the socket in the sphere, tried it on. The threads matched perfectly. Dan looked at Cassia. She was standing with a torch. Her face was calm, her eyes attentive. She nodded. Dan. Dan looked at Ha-in. She stood with a notebook pressed to her chest. Her glasses glinted in the blue light of the symbols. She nodded. Dan looked at Do-yun. She stood to the side. Her hands were folded in front of her chest. Her lips were moving. She was praying. In a language no one on this continent knew anymore. She opened her eyes, looked at him, and nodded. 5 o'clock. Dan began to screw in the coupling, slowly, turn by turn. The threads entered the socket with a sound he had never heard before. Low, pure, as if the metal were singing. Every turn required effort, not physical, magical. Skill screwed the coupling into the sphere, and with every turn, Dan felt the contour come to life, like water in dead pipes beginning to move, barely noticeable at first, then faster. The rumble grew louder, the walls vibrated, drops on the ceiling trembled. 6 o'clock, the final turn. The coupling settled into the socket. The seals expanded. The connection was airtight. Dan felt it, like a click, like a lock that had closed. He released the coupling. He took a step back. His hands were empty. Mana at 0. His body drained to the limit. He could barely stand. One thing remained. The valve. Next to the socket in the sphere was a lever, bronze, covered in patina. No one had touched it in 200 years. Dan placed his hand on the lever. Cold, heavy. He turned it. The lever didn't move. It was stuck. 200 years without movement. Metal fused to metal. Dan pressed down. Nothing. Cassia approached. She placed her hand on top of his. Together they pushed. The lever wavered. It shifted a centimeter. Ha-in approached from the other side. She placed her hand on it. The 3 of them. The lever began to move, slowly, with a creak and a grind. Do-yun didn't join them. She stood to the side and sang, quietly, in her dead language. The lever turned all the way, and the contour sighed. It was a sound Dan would never forget for the rest of his life. Not a single one of them. A low bass rumble rolled through the hall, along the walls, through the pipes, through the stone, upward, in all directions, as if something huge and ancient had awakened after a long sleep. The water started flowing. Dan sensed it instinctively. He saw the entire system, how the water gushed through the coupling into the lower half of the contour, how it filled the dead pipes, hundreds of kilometers, how the pressure built, how the valves that had been closed for 300 years began to open, one after another, automatically. The system was designed for this. 1,000 years ago, whoever had designed it so that it could restart after any downtime, all it needed was the coupling, Just one part. The hall shook. Chunks of stone fell from the ceiling. Cassia grabbed Dan by the collar and dragged him toward the exit. Ha-Rin ran after them. Jo-Yun walked calmly, barefoot on the wet stone. The water was no longer dripping. It was pouring down the walls, across the floor, up the stairs. They climbed quickly, Cassia in front, Ha-Rin behind her. Dan was crawling. Literally, he had no strength left. Cassia turned back, hoisted him onto her shoulder, like a sack, carried him. Dan tried to protest. Cassia told him to be quiet. He fell silent. It was morning upstairs. They had spent the whole night underground. Dan climbed out of the shaft in Cassia's arms and saw the sky. Gray. Cloudy. Clouds. Real, heavy clouds that hadn't been seen here in 3 years. And the first drop fell on his face. Then a second. Then a downpour. The rain came crashing down on Whitehall like a wall, so thick you couldn't see 2 steps ahead. Celeste stood up there with her arms raised. The barrier over the work zone glowed blue. She'd been holding it for 6 hours. Her hands were shaking. Her face was white. But she held it, because Dan told her to hold it. Amber ran toward them across the square, soaked to the bone, with a thermos of hot tea. Because she knew. She always knew he needed hot tea. May stood on the street corner and yelled at people not to go into the basements. The water was rising in the lower neighborhoods. Not critically. The evacuation had worked. 12,000 people had left in time. The basements were half a meter underwater. The foundations held. No one was hurt, because Amber and May had done their job. Dan sat on the wet ground. Rain poured down on his head. Cassia stood beside him, wet, with wet daggers. She silently placed her hand on his shoulder. Do-Yun sat on the other side, barefoot in a puddle, wet hair on her shoulders. She looked up at the sky and cried. For the first time in 200 years, she saw rain. Ha-Rin stood and took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, taking them off. The glasses were wet from the rain and tears, and wiping them was pointless, but she kept doing it. The royal guard stood in the square with their mouths agape, in full armor, in the rain, not knowing what to do, because the regulations didn't say what to do when water falls from the sky. Dan sat and cried. For the first time in 2 years, his tears mingled with the rain. He had simply installed a coupling. He had simply replaced a part. Dan had created a new coupling from an enchanted alloy in 6 hours. He installed it in the heart of the circuit. He turned the valve together with Cassia and Ha-Rin. The circuit restarted. Water gushed through the continent's pipes. For the first time in 3 years, it rained over Whitehall. The evacuation worked. No one was hurt. Celeste held the barrier for 6 hours. Amber brought tea. It rained for 3 days. Not a downpour. After the first squall, it settled into a steady, warm stream. The earth drank, greedily, like a person who hadn't eaten in a week and was served a bowl of soup. The Sylvan and Adar rivers began to fill on the 2nd day. By the end of the 3rd day, the capital's aqueducts were knee-deep in water that flowed on its own, without mages, without mana, simply because the mountain springs had come to life. Dan slept through the first 24 hours. Amber wouldn't let anyone in to see him. Not Cassia, not the king, not the messengers. She sat by the door to his room at the Copper Mug Inn and told everyone that the master was resting. Brenda, the innkeeper, brought her tea and a blanket. Amber didn't leave. When Dan woke up, she was sitting on a chair by his bed, knitting. She had learned to knit somewhere between Asheford and the capital. Dan asked how long he had slept. She replied that it had been 26 hours. Dan asked what was happening. Amber told him. Rain. The rivers are filling up. Wells throughout the kingdom were yielding water. Messengers had arrived from 6 neighboring realms. In 4 of the 6, the rains had begun. In the remaining 2, the water table had risen. The drought was receding. Not instantly, but visibly, tangibly. Dan nodded. Then he asked about Corvin Tate. Amber fell silent. Then she said that Tate had stood on the balcony of the guild tower in the rain for 4 hours, alone, without his robe. Then he went into his office and didn't come out. Dan didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. And something else. Something quiet and sad. Tate wasn't a villain. Tate was a man who had believed his whole life that his path was the right one. And yesterday he saw the rain that proved the opposite. On the 3rd day, Dan got up and left the inn. The city had changed. People walked the streets and looked up at the sky, as if they were seeing it for the first time. Children ran through the puddles, real puddles. In the square in front of City Hall, a woman was washing clothes in the rainwater right on the pavement, and she was laughing. Dan walked down the street and felt the water, everywhere. The contour was working. He could feel its pulse through his skill. Steady, powerful, alive. The system had awakened and was doing what it was created to do. Regulating flows, directing underground rivers, feeding springs, balancing pressure. Without mages, without mana, just pipes, just a slope, just the physics of water. Cassia walked beside him. She was silent. Her face bore an expression he had never seen before. Peace. Cassia Vane, blade of the shadow, 15 years of killing behind her, and peace on her face in the rain in the capital, next to a guy who was fixing pipes. She said quietly that now she didn't know what to do, that her whole life had been about danger, about protection, about knives in the dark. And now there was rain and people were laughing, and she had nothing to protect. Dan looked at her and said that wasn't true, that the problem ahead was bigger than the drought, because now that there was plenty of water again, the question would arise of who it belonged to. Cassia looked at him. Then she smiled. She said he didn't know how to enjoy victory. Dan replied that he would enjoy it when there was water in every faucet and it seemed normal. A week after the contour was restarted, the king convened a grand council, all 6 kingdoms, including Voltum. Baron Halvik arrived in person. He had aged 10 years over the past 3. His river was no longer the sole source of water. His monopoly had collapsed along with the drought. He looked at Dan across the table, and in his eyes was hatred. And something else. Understanding. He understood that he had lost not to a man, but to a pipe. That his empire had been destroyed not by a sword or magic, but by a ceramic cylinder with a 2-degree tilt. Celeste sat 3 seats away from her father. They did not speak. She was in work clothes, with clay stains on her cuffs, with a notebook full of calculations. She looked like an engineer. For the first time in her life, she looked like someone who knew why she was there. The Baron looked at her once. She looked at him. He looked away first. The council adopted the expanded water charter, all 6 kingdoms. Dan presented the plan. 10 years, full coverage of the continent, water supply for every city and every village, training local crews, transfer of knowledge, establishment of engineering schools in every capital. He spoke for an hour, without a hitch, with figures, with Ha-Rin's maps, with Celesta's calculations. Tate listened from a far corner. Then he stood up and asked to speak. The hall fell silent. Tate said that the guild recognized the effectiveness of the water master's system, that 3,000 water mages were ready to cooperate, that their magic could reinforce the pipes, speed up construction, improve purification, that he was proposing not a replacement but an integration, magic and engineering together. Dan looked at him, an old, weary man who had just given up his life's work, in front of everyone, publicly. Dan stood up and crossed the hall. He approached Tate. He held out his hand. Tate looked at the hand, then at Dan, then shook it. The hall exhaled. Months passed. Dan worked. He was always working. The crews had scattered across the continent. Grant was building a highway in Greendale. Nora was keeping track of 5 simultaneous projects. Will the potter had opened a workshop in Asheford and was teaching apprentices how to make pipes. May was managing the Capitals network. She had grown up. She had matured. She hadn't taken off her cap, but she swore less often. Kasia headed the Waterway Security Service. The former bandits from the pass had become her people. They guarded the pipes like a temple, because those pipes gave them work and food and water, and because Kasia ordered it, and no one wanted to disappoint Kasia. Ha-Rin completed the atlas of the continent's underground waters, 200 sheets, every aquifer from coast to coast. She presented it at the Council of the 6 Kingdoms, and the hall gave her a standing ovation. She stood with the atlas in her hands, not knowing where to look. Then her eyes found Dan in the back row. He nodded. She put on the glasses she had just taken off and smiled. Celeste founded the first school of engineering and magic in Whitehall. 20 students, mages and craftsmen together. She taught them what Dan had taught her, that the system shouldn't depend on a single person, that a master's value isn't that nothing works without him, but that after him, everything works on its own. Do-Yun left, quietly, without saying goodbye. One morning, Dan went down to the underground hall, and she was gone. Only wet footprints on the floor leading to the wall. And the wall was solid, no passage, no door, as if the stone had closed behind her. Dan stood in the empty hall. The contours hummed around him. Pipes carried water. Symbols on the walls glowed brightly, blue, alive. He pressed his palm against the wall and felt it. Not her, but something of her. Warmth, a presence, as if she had become part of the water, part of the contour, part of what she had guarded her whole long life. Dan stood there for a minute. Then he nodded and went upstairs. Amber was waiting with tea. A year had passed since the reboot. Dan stood on the hill behind Littlebrook, where 2 years ago he had emerged from the barn with hay in his head and a stranger's body. He looked out at the village. 33 houses, green fields, a full well in the square, and pipes. His pipes. Ceramic. The first ones. Rough compared to what he could do now, but they worked. Water was flowing. Granny Meg was sitting on a bench by her house. A faucet stood nearby. Bronze. Dan had installed it on his last visit, replaced the old ceramic one. Meg turned the handle. Water poured into the bucket. Clean. Cold. Meg didn't even look at the faucet. It had become normal. Just water. Just a faucet. Just life. Dan watched it and thought. In 100 years, no one would remember his name. The pipes would still be there. The water would still flow. People would turn the faucets without a second thought, just like they turn doorknobs, just like they breathe. And that would mean he'd done everything right. The best engineering is the kind you don't notice. Amber came up behind him. She stood beside him, silently. They stood on the hill and looked out at the village. The wind carried the scent of wet earth. Somewhere below, water gurgled in a pipe. That very sound, his favorite sound. Amber said quietly that she needed to tell him something. Dan looked at her. Redhead. Freckled. 19 years old. Serious eyes. Her hands fiddled with the edge of her apron. She said she knew he wasn't her real brother, that she'd realized it on the first day when he came out of the barn and walked toward the temple. His gait, his voice, his gaze, everything else. She'd kept quiet for 2 years because she didn't care who he was. What mattered to her was that he was there, that he drank the tea she brewed, that he wore the boots she bought, that he came to dinner even if he was late. She said she didn't need to know where he came from. She needed to know if he would stay. Dan was silent. He looked at the village, at the fields, at the chimney glinting in the sun. Then he said he would stay. Amber exhaled, quietly, as if she'd been holding that breath for 2 years. Then she said dinner would be in an hour, and that if he was late, she'd give his portion to Kasha. And she went downstairs. Dan watched her go. Then he looked at his hands. Hands that had fixed the plumbing. Hands that had replaced a part the size of a barrel and restarted a system the size of a continent. The hands of an 18-year-old boy in a foreign world with a class that was considered useless. He dropped his hands, turned toward the village, and went to dinner. Because Amber had said in an hour, and he had learned not to be late. Down in Littlebrook, Granny Meg turned off the faucet. The water stopped flowing. Meg grabbed a bucket and carried it into the house. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at the faucet. She didn't think about it. Because a faucet is just a faucet, and water is just water. That's how it's supposed to be.